Lamar Waldron, our next speaker, has been writing professionally since 1983 for clients ranging from Coca-Cola, the Coke connection, and the Disney organization, from there to Georgia Public Television. His research on John Kennedy and organized crime has been spotlighted on the Arts and Entertainment Channel and the New Republic and Vanity Fair. He has a master's degree in counseling, and prior to his writing career, he worked for the state of Georgia as director of an outpatient counseling center for juvenile offenders and their families. It's a great pleasure to introduce Lamar Waldron.
Thank you, George Michael. First off, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, I'm going to be going over more details about Trafficante and Marcello's heroin network and how it was used to kill JFK. I'll also be sharing new and important details that we've never revealed before about several different aspects of Project Freedom.
Put the mic closer to your mouth.
Let's see.
Maybe tilt.
That's good. I think so. Yeah. Yeah, I'll just sit real close to it like this. Okay. First, though, I want to say that George Michael's excellent presentation shows that aside from the Kennedys just targeting organized crime in general, they had very specifically targeted that heroin network. And that gave those people the ultimate motivation to kill JFK. For them, it was simply a matter of survival. They killed JFK, ended that prosecution and persecution, and got to continue their operations where he stayed alive, and big changes were going to come down, and they were going to be largely out of business. Now, first, I do want to make a couple of other comments. I want to stress that everything we've discovered over the last 6 years has only been building upon the research of dozens of other people. Too many to name, but they include Mary Ferrell, Paul Hoke, Bill Turner, Gary Shaw, Peter Dale Scott, George Michael here, and many more. Jim Lazar at the AARC up in Washington has been invaluable, and I urge you to contribute any kind of support you can to the AARC in Washington. Now, last year, I, with Tom's help, used lots of overhead showing as many documents as possible. And I think that was needed then to establish a firm level of credibility and documentation, but it also slowed things down a lot, so we were not able to cover as much stuff as we would have liked to. This year, we've chosen to dispense with the overheads, so we're not going to be using the slides or anything like that, in favor of conveying more information, being able to share more about Project Freedom and the killing of John Kennedy with you. However, for those of you who do want to see documentation for a lot of what Tom was talking about and some of the things I'll mention, the A.S.K folks here, wonderful folks that they are, still have last year's videotape available. And many parts of the documentation are clearly visible on the overhead screen that you can see in the videotape of the presentation last year. So I would urge you, if you're interested in seeing that, to purchase a copy of that tape last year. First off, to understand how the drug network was used by the Mafia to penetrate Project Freedom and to kill John F. Kennedy, let's look at the major heroin kingpin in America in the 1960s, Santos Trafficante, the mob boss of Tampa and much of Florida. Now, as Heinrich Kruger says in his excellent book, The Heroin Coup, by 1960, Trafficante controlled a Cuban mafia, mostly out of Cuba, but a little bit in Cuba, composed of Cuban officers, security staffers, and former politicians. As Kruger says, it specialized in narcotics, first Latin American cocaine, then heroin from Marseille in France. The staff of Newsday have noted that 10% of the members of the Bay of Pigs invasion force, 1,500-man invasion force, had been or eventually would be arrested for narcotics violations. So there was a lot of penetration into that Cuban network by Trafficante. Now, as an aside, let me always be quick to point out that still leaves 90% of those brave Bay of Pigs veterans who fought hard to try to get their country back as uninvolved in drugs. And that 10% should in no way reflect badly on the vast majority of Cuban exile fighters who weren't involved in any criminal activities, who turned down those temptations. Anyway, as Kruger notes, even Jimmy Hoffa's Teamster Local 320 down in Miami, which Trafficante helped to found and was sometimes his base of operations, that was cited by the McClellan Committee hearings the hearings that included Senator John Kennedy and Chief Counsel Robert Kennedy in '59, they cited that Teamster local as being a front for narcotics. So Trafficante had also enlisted the Teamsters, some of them, as part of this effort. Now, as Charles Saragusa, one of the country's top narcotics agents in the 60s, and who also had interesting intelligence connections, points out in his book, The Trail of the Poppy, there were several ways the French got their heroin into the U.S. Two of these ways have a lot of significance for how John F. Kennedy was killed. One pipeline, one of many pipelines, was to get the heroin from Marseille into Mexico, either taking it directly into Mexico or taking it to Havana, and then from Havana on scheduled flights into Mexico City. Now, I do want to point out when it was going that Havana route, it wasn't Fidel Castro that was facilitating that transshipment. It was French Corsican mobsters, associates of the QJ agent QJ Wynn, who were helping that bit of the pipeline. But anyway, this one pipeline starts in Marseille, winds up one way or another in Mexico. Then it gets important to us because then it's brought into the U.S. through Texas and up through to Chicago, where they had a nice pool of heroin addicts ready to use it. Now, this route's important to us because the heroin pipeline leading up from Mexico through Texas and on Chicago was crucial to the network that killed John Kennedy. Now, we even know the mobster who guided this particular leg of the operation, the leg from Mexico up through Texas. It was a Frenchman by the name of Lucien Rivard. Now, Rivard was a very close associate of Trafficante, collected through many documents, and he was the mentor of QJ Wynn, about whom we'll talk more later. Now, an important stop on this heroin route, as you might imagine, going from Mexico up toward Chicago through Texas, was Dallas, Texas. That was an important stop on it. And there was a minor mob figure in Dallas who was from Chicago, who, according to many reports, was involved in the narcotics trade, and that was Jack Ruby. Now, he was a small cog in a very big wheel, but he had demonstrated that he could be trusted as part of the mob's most secure, profitable, and ruthless arm, the heroin trade, for years. Now, even though Ruby was in Dallas, under the general control of New Orleans mob boss Carlos Marcello, the heroin was part of Trafficante's operation, who, of course, cut in Marcello on part of the deal. And Ruby had met Trafficante in 1959, while Trafficante was in prison in Cuba. So Ruby was ideal. He was from Chicago, the eventual destination of the heroin. He had shown he could be trusted to operate on Marcello's turf here in Dallas, and he'd worked for Trafficante on that Cuban operation in 1959. Now, if you think about it, though, the very things that made him useful to Marcello and Trafficante for their narcotic smuggling are the very same factors that would make Jack Ruby a valuable part of their plan to kill John Kennedy. Now, another route that's important to us is what's usually thought of when people think about the movie or the book, the French Connection. Now, that's hiding heroin in a car and shipping it over on an ocean liner, just like you saw in the movie. That wasn't an isolated incident. That happened dozens and dozens, perhaps hundreds of times. And one of the men who helped perfect that technique of hiding the heroin in the cars, shipping it over on the luxury liners, was QJ Wynn, the narcotics trafficker that the CIA also hired as an assassin and to recruit assassins for the CIA. Now, I mentioned that other route where you go through Mexico and up through to Chicago. Now, obviously, if you could get heroin to America without having to go through Cuba or through Mexico, where various officials and gangsters always had to get their cut, if you could get it directly into America's largest city, like New York City, where the users were, it was much more efficient and much more profitable for the mob. Also, though, it was much more difficult to do and the risks were much greater. But the mob managed to get many shipments through. There were occasional problems, though. One of QJ Wynn's shipments was busted in 1962. Now, this was a direct result of Robert Kennedy's crackdown on organized crime and specifically the narcotics trade. QJ Wynn lost the shipment. It got busted. Now, the shipment was traced to QJ Wynn, who was not arrested. A courier was. The heroin was lost, but QJ Wynn wasn't arrested. But the shipment was traced to him by U.S. Investigatory agencies, and the U.S. applied pressure to a European country where QJ Wynn resided to prosecute. They said, hey, we know this heroin came from him, shipped it over from France, get him, prosecute him. We're cracking down on this. But mysteriously, guess what? No charges were pressed against QJ Wynn, thanks to the CIA. Working for the agency, especially on assassination operations, as QJ Wynn was doing, does bring certain rewards. Now, even though the CIA intervened to keep QJ Wynn from being prosecuted in Europe, there was still the matter of that missing heroin, the heroin that had been confiscated in New York City. Someone had to make good on that, what was lost. Now, QJ Wynn was fairly well off, was wealthy by that time, but not that wealthy. We know how much heroin QJ Wynn lost on a later shipment, and it was probably about the same amount. 200 pounds of almost pure heroin. Now, that would take an enormous amount of money to make up, and QJ Wynn was responsible for that. Now, of course, QJ Wynn was getting money from the CIA every month. It added up to the grand sum by the time of the exchange rates of approximately $700 to $800 a month, paid through the Paris CIA station every month. Now, if you're QJ Wynn, where are your loyalties going to be after that bust? To the CIA or to Traficante and the mob. You owe the mob this much for that missing heroin. The CIA is paying you this much every month. If you keep running heroin for the mob, you can keep making lots of money. And if you use your CIA cover to help Traficante accomplish a goal essential to his survival, the killing of JFK to stop Bobby Kennedy's war on Traficante, then just maybe Traficante will cut you a deal on making up for the heroin that was confiscated. And that's exactly what happened. Plus it wasn't an either-or thing. It's not like QJ Wynn chose between the CIA or Traficante. QJ Wynn was careful enough to hide the worst of his activities from the CIA while he was working for Traficante. Now, he succeeded at that, not indefinitely, though. Eventually, by the winter of 1964, the CIA did finally become suspicious that they were being played for dupes, and they terminated QJ Wynn. Now, remember that Tom said one of the major parts of Project Freedom was the training of Cuban-American recruits at Fort Benning, Georgia. And remember that Traficante wanted to penetrate Project Freedom any way he could to get his hands into it. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that QJ Wynn, Traficante's man, was active in connection with Fort Benning down in Columbus, Georgia. He was smuggling heroin into Fort Benning through cars and appliances of officers who were returning from duty in Europe, especially Germany. They'd hide the heroin in the refrigerators or the cars. They'd be shipped to Fort Benning. QJ Wynn would go there, get his heroin, everybody would be happy. All this, though, was going on while Project Freedom was happening. And while QJ Wynn was supposed to be working on killing Castro for the CIA, as part of one of the many CIA mob plots. So, by the way, we know about Traficante's heroin pipeline through Fort Benning because that ring was eventually busted in the mid-1960s. And so you've got QJ Wynn operating in Fort Benning while that secret training for Project Freedom is going on, and we feel certain that's one of the many ways Traficante got a hook into what was going on with Project Freedom. Now, was QJ Wynn in Dallas when the JFK assassination occurred? FBI documents seem to indicate that he was. Gary Shaw did some excellent work tracking down immigration officials in Dallas who remembered deporting two mysterious figures, foreigners, same nationality as QJ Wynn, right after the Kennedy assassination. The description of one of these two men deported, same nationality as QJ Wynn, matches QJ Wynn almost identically. So we feel very definitely QJ Wynn was in Dallas when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Now, why hasn't the CIA told us, or the Church Committee, or the House Select Committee, or even Senator Gary Hart, who once went to Europe, all the way to Europe, just to try and interview QJ Wynn, why haven't they told any of these people just who QJ Wynn was? Why weren't the people who recruited and worked with QJ Wynn and who knew his true identity put under oath and called to testify about his identity and other activities? Well, a few good reasons for that, folks. It's because QJ Wynn is still alive, and it's because he was involved in sensitive CIA operations even though he was a criminal. And it was particularly embarrassing to the CIA because Bobby Kennedy had told them they shouldn't employ mobsters without telling him first, but they went ahead and did it anyway. Now, QJ Wynn is still protected, as we discovered when Tom went to Europe to track him down in his own nation, and QJ Wynn is still protected by the intelligence agency of his own country. And there's another reason QJ Wynn's identity is still being withheld, and that's because of his informer status, which Tom hinted at earlier. Now, informer status for the people involved with the JFK assassination wasn't just important for QJ Wynn, but also in the cases of people like Ruby, Oswald, and at least one person who unfortunately worked on Project Freedom. An informant was uniquely valuable to the mob in carrying out and helping to cover up the assassination. First, the informant by definition had a trusted relationship with one or more law enforcement or intelligence agencies. The agencies would therefore tend to believe what the informant says. Otherwise, he wouldn't be an informant. If he says, hey, I just happened to be in Dallas, I was digging up information for you guys, I was pursuing this operation just like you guys wanted, and gee, the assassination just happened to happen then, well, the agency might just tend to believe him. This puts an informant in the unique and powerful position of being able to insert disinformation into the law enforcement and intelligence pipeline, too. Disinformation which can throw suspicion away from the real culprits or the informant and towards the patsy, for example. Trafficante and Marcello also knew that the law enforcement and intelligence agencies frequently jealously guarded the identities of their informants from other agencies. They wouldn't even share that, they'd identify them by T3 or T4. And the FBI wouldn't tell the CIA, and the CIA wouldn't tell the Bureau of Narcotics. Bureau of Narcotics wouldn't tell Army Intelligence. Total turf wars. Now, again, this can help to stymie any investigation, and Marcello and Trafficante knew that. Also, an informant, such as QJ Wynn, is very hard to prosecute because they often know too much. They could expose various operations that may have taken that agency years to put into place. Finally, the mob knew, because of their links to intelligence agencies like the CIA and their links to the FBI by ex-agents like Guy Bannister in New Orleans, that agencies could be counted upon to cover their own tracks if their informants wound up in something embarrassing, and sometimes that did happen. Better to keep some things quiet than to cause a boss or a co-worker to be fired because they recruited an informant who turned out to be bad. So, all through the JFK assassination, you'll find that Trafficante and Marcello were careful to either choose people who already had informant status among most of the agencies or who were very strongly developing that status. Now, of course, even Trafficante, and to a lesser degree Marcello, were in a great position to blackmail certain parts of the government, if it ever came to that, because of their involvement in the CIA mob plots. Remember, the CIA kept Trafficante's role in their efforts to murder Castro secret for over a decade after the assassination of Kennedy. So you've got a perfect example there on the record of the CIA coddling and protecting one of America's top mobsters. Now, one thing I see happening today, unfortunately, in comments from researchers and writers, is pinning the blame on the Kennedys for the mob's involvement in the CIA plots to kill Castro. I'm seeing that more and more through little bits and pieces here and there, which may seem to emanate from the CIA. Now, of course, there is some controversy involved as to when the Kennedys first learned of these plots, and that's a legitimate field of inquiry that we and others are pursuing and about which many researchers differ, but that's not what I'm talking about. What I mean is that some writers seem to forget that even the CIA admits to bringing the mob in to those plots in the beginning of the summer of 1960, which is before Kennedy was even elected president. He was just a senator. He was just a candidate, and here's Trafficante already in on these plots. Dan Moldea, an excellent researcher, has strong evidence that there was an even earlier CIA mob plot involving three gangsters, Plumeri, Granello, and Bufalino, that began as early as 1959. So those plots you always read about with Roselli and Trafficante beginning, that's the second round of CIA mob plots, not the first. Now, we have confirmed Moldea's research that a CIA mob plot was indeed active in 1959. And what's most important to remember about all of this is it's before JFK was even president. It was under the Eisenhower administration that the mob, including Trafficante, was brought into the plots to kill Castro. And the point man in the Eisenhower administration for Cuba was, from most accounts, including his own, Richard Nixon. So the start of the thread that led to JFK's death began on Nixon's watch, not JFK's. And it was wildly stepped up by Nixon during the 1960 presidential campaign, his attempt to get elected by getting Castro killed by any means possible. But the seeds of it go deeper than that, back even farther. And this is why you'll see Robert Kennedy had just had no place for using mobsters to try and get rid of Castro. In 1959, when Senator John Kennedy was on the Senate McClellan Committee and Robert Kennedy was its chief counsel, they were stymied in their attempt to subpoena a mobster connected to those 1959 CIA mob plots. They wanted to testify and get him up there to show that the mobsters and the Teamsters were working in heroin and narcotics. Had it all figured out, had great groundwork laid, but the CIA told them back off in the name of national security. Reportedly, Bobby was furious at that. Here was their chance to tie the Teamsters to the mob in a narcotics operation, and the CIA wouldn't let them do it. Now, I want to point out that from what we know, Bobby wasn't even told then that this man he wanted to subpoena, this mobster, was involved with the CIA in a plot to kill Castro. Bobby was only told to back off for some vague reasons of national security. That's why Bobby Kennedy was so angry in May of 1962 when he learned details of the CIA mob plots. It wasn't the first time that he'd been inconvenienced because the CIA was in bed with the mafia. And as we keep stressing, it was that same mob-CIA connection that enabled Trafficante to penetrate Project Freedom and to get away with killing the president. Now, Robert Kennedy tried desperately to keep the mafia out of Project Freedom. Now, that meant banning certain exile leaders who had very strong mob connections. But in spite of the efforts of Bobby and his men, we're sad to report the mob did manage to learn about Project Freedom and the Cuba contingency plan Tom had talked about, and they used that knowledge to cover up their involvement in JFK's death. Now, to understand Project Freedom, because it was a sizable operation, even though it was highly secret, it's helpful to realize that every Cuban exile group and leader in the United States in 1963, and there were hundreds of them, could be put into just 3 categories as far as Project Freedom was concerned. And it's handy to think of them in terms of a bell curve. The classic bell curve that starts small, gets real big, and then gets small again, kind of like a boa constrictor swallowing a rabbit, for instance. First, there was the relatively small number of leaders at one of the small ends of groups that were excluded from any involvement in Project Freedom because of their ties to organized crime or because they had brazenly violated U.S. policy. This group included the notorious Rolando Mas Ferrer, among others. Now, the next group, the big group, the bulge, was by far the largest. It included groups that, while not part of Project Freedom, were given token support and essentially were allowed to boil water, for lack of a better term. They may be useful someday, but Bobby Kennedy didn't want to sever ties to them, but they had not been told of Project Freedom, and they certainly were not privy to intelligence about or from Project Freedom. Now, the vast majority of the Cuban exile groups in 1963 fell into that big category. Now, finally, at the other small end of our bell curve, there were the 5 groups that had heavy official support from the Kennedy administration, though this funding was often carefully laundered to ensure that the support wasn't obvious. The leaders of these groups were eventually to be part of a coalition government in Cuba that would rule. It would also probably include one or more of the coup leaders, and they would rule until democratic elections were held. That was the Kennedy's goal. Now, these groups were composed of Manuel Artemi and Pepe San Ramon down in Central America. In other words, when the coup happened, they would launch their ships from there, and they would land after the coup was hopefully successful. There was Manolo Rey and Hure, Sylvia Odio's group she was a member of, based in Puerto Rico, among other places. There was Eloy Manoyo, based in the Dominican Republic. That's where he was going to launch his ships from when the coup occurred. And there were the Cuban-American troops being trained at Fort Benning in Columbus, Georgia, and they would be invited in by the coalition government if more support were needed. Now, finally, there was somebody we didn't mention last year, but who had finally joined up with Project Freedom by the fall of 1963. Now, that person, fifth spoke in the wheel, was a guy named Antonio Verona. Very powerful man in pre-Castro Cuba, very powerful man in the American exile movement. Now, Tony Verona's involvement is troubling, however, because of his close involvement with Santos Trafficante. Trafficante worked very closely with Verona on the CIA mob plots beginning in 1960. They worked hand in glove. It's all through the Church Committee report. Now, I'm not saying that Verona had any knowing involvement in JFK's assassination. Far from it. Since Verona was part of Project Freedom, it was really in his best interest to see it come off, and he'd become part of that coalition government. That way, but Verona had close associates who did not want to see Project Freedom happen. Among them were Santos Trafficante and Rolando Mas Ferrer. And we have documented that Tony Verona was talking to Rolando Mas Ferrer about Project Freedom, about sneaking Rolando Mas Ferrer, Trafficante's man, into Project Freedom in the late fall of 1963, very short time before JFK's assassination. Now, this is the same Mas Ferrer whose notorious brother Kiki lived in the same apartment complex as Sylvia Odio. For that matter, Tony Verona was very close to Sylvia Odio's uncle, this uncle was mysteriously at Oswald's trial in New Orleans for disturbing the peace. This was the same Rolando Masferrer that Jack Ruby bragged about knowing, as cited in George Michael's excellent book. So unfortunately, we have another weak link in the chain by which Trafficante could learn about Project Freedom. Now, we told you last year about this interesting guy named John Martino, who bragged to the FBI about his knowledge of Project Freedom, and that's in a Warren Commission document, no less. There's a lot of good new information about Martino in the new Vanity Fair article by Summers, and I urge you to read that. But here's something else that we found recently that Martino wrote in an article back in 1963 about Project Freedom. It was just published 4 weeks after the assassination. In the December 21, 1963 issue of Human Events, he says, and this is a quote, "For almost 6 months it has been assumed in Cuban circles in Miami and Havana that the Kennedy administration planned to eliminate Fidel Castro, his brother Raul, and Che Guevara, and various others through a coup." He goes on to say that the plan involved more or less a token invasion from Central America that would be synchronized with this coup. A left-wing coalition government was to be set up after that, including leaders from the Cuban Communist Party. Now again, this is what a close associate of Trafficante and Johnny Roselli is writing just a few weeks after John Kennedy has been laid to rest. And now, this man who wrote that, Martino, who died in the 70s, it turns out he did acknowledge privately to others, you read about this in the Vanity Fair article, that he had indeed been involved with JFK's assassination. Now, Martino's main role in JFK's assassination was to spread disinformation, blaming Oswald's actions on Castro and hinting at Project Freedom. Now, he was supposed to do this in order to panic the U.S. intelligence agencies into thinking that Castro was behind the assassination, possibly, and to fire into action the cover-up apparatus of that Cuba contingency plan that Tom had spoken about earlier. After all, if Martino, who was hinting about Project Freedom, as we saw in the article he wrote, if he knew about Project Freedom, why couldn't Castro have known? The thinking went, and then why couldn't he maybe have retaliated by having JFK killed? And as you know, if you could make intelligence agency people think that, then that would ensure that Cuba contingency plan stayed activated, and it would ensure there couldn't be a thorough public investigation of the assassination for national security reasons. So John Martino and his very, very close associate, now deceased, so we can talk about him, Frank Sturgis, who also worked closely with Trafficante, they both kept spreading the stories that Oswald or Ruby had gone to Cuba and were acting on the orders of Castro. Now, the Warren Commission took some of these stories very seriously and looked at them very closely, but eventually they had to drop them because it was getting too close to these national security considerations. Now, Tom had mentioned that Cuba contingency plan earlier, which had a lot to do with the cover-up we've all battled against for 30 years. Now, how important was that Cuba contingency plan in covering up unintentionally the mob's role in the assassination? Well, let's look at the autopsy. Now, controversy is raised about the autopsy for years, beginning with David Lifton, continuing Dr. Gary Aguilar, and others. Much excellent research has been done about the discrepancies in the photos, the x-rays, and the various descriptions of the wounds. We've all heard some great presentations about that this weekend. Now, one thing you should always keep in mind, however, though, is who was in control of that autopsy, who was really calling the shots and ordering what would or wouldn't be done down in the autopsy room. It wasn't some secret team. It wasn't LBJ. It wasn't J. Edgar Hoover. It was Robert Kennedy. While he wasn't in the autopsy room, he was in a waiting room on another level with Jackie, but he was calling the shots through constant telephone communications. Now, this is a very sensitive area I'm about to talk about, and it's one of the few places where I'll tell you in advance that we really can't give you any more information or names, so please don't ask us, because of confidentiality agreements we've made with our sources. So again, please don't bother asking us about this one specific thing. Other questions we'll always do our best to try and answer, because our knowledge about this is very limited, but we have to keep it very confidential. But we do have it on the highest, best, and most impeccable authority that one of Robert Kennedy's top people in heading Project Freedom was Robert Kennedy's liaison at the autopsy. Now, this is a man whose name has never surfaced before in conjunction with the autopsy, but we've confirmed independently he was there, and we have it on the best source that he was Robert Kennedy's liaison there. Now, this man made sure that Bobby's instructions with regard to the autopsy were carried out to the letter. And additionally, we do know that the man was placed in that position because there were, quote, national security, end quote, implications to the autopsy. Now, keep in mind again that Bobby Kennedy was surely aware of the observations of Kenneth O'Donnell and others that there had been shots from the front, and therefore had probably concluded already that the murder had been committed by members of some sort of conspiracy. And Bobby knew that when he made his decision about who to use as his liaison at the autopsy. Now, this person Bobby used had no medical training, and he really wasn't as close to Bobby as some of the other people who were there at Bethesda. However, this person did have one outstanding qualification, and that was that he knew everything there was to know about Project Freedom and the Cuba contingency plan. That had, in fact, been his full-time focus for months. Now, what about the body after the autopsy? One of the men who helped to draft that Cuba contingency plan we've been talking about took charge of the body on Saturday. And remember, the autopsy didn't even end until Saturday morning. And helped with the funeral arrangements until Kennedy's burial on Monday. So you've got almost a perfect chain of possession here between people who were very knowledgeable about Project Freedom and about the Cuba contingency plan from the time John Kennedy's body is brought to Bethesda until the time it's laid to rest. Now, I'm not saying that either of these two men I'm referring to did anything wrong. Now, far from it. They and Bobby Kennedy were carrying out the spirit of the Cuba contingency plan in everything they did. They had, in fact, the noblest of motives to protect the security of Project Freedom and the lives of the people within it, and to prevent us from all being vaporized in a nuclear holocaust that Khrushchev had so recently threatened during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The fact that their actions would cause all of us so much grief 30 years later was the least of their worries at the time. Now, some people who covered things up were perhaps not acting as nobly as Bobby Kennedy and his associates. Among them might be David Atlee Phillips. But even his strange actions may not point to his involvement in assassinating John F. Kennedy as much as it points to his desire to cover up other activities, some authorized by Bobby Kennedy and some not authorized by Bobby Kennedy. For example, let's assume for the moment that Antonio Vecchiana is accurate in his account of Maurice Bishop meeting Lee Oswald here in Dallas in September of 1963. And let's assume, just for the moment, sake of argument, that those who say David Phillips and Maurice Bishop are the same are correct. Let's just have that assumption for a few minutes. Now, how could you explain David Atlee Phillips, a high CIA official, meeting with Lee Harvey Oswald, a Russian defector, in a public place here in Dallas just 2 or 3 months before the assassination? How does that make sense? I mean, really, if one wanted to argue Phillips was involved in the assassination, that's not a very smart thing for him to do, to be meeting with the patsy in a public place like that. And David Phillips was known in Dallas. He'd grown up around here. But there are some possible explanations. One CIA associate of Phillips has speculated that David Phillips would have only met with Oswald in Dallas, Texas, if he thought Oswald might have been able to get into Cuba, where he might be of use to Phillips. It's recently been established that Phillips headed up that section of the CIA that was in charge of penetrating and monitoring the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Now, Richard Kane, it's an interesting name, interesting man, who was the mob boss Sam Giancana's right-hand man up in Chicago. Giancana was an interesting position. He was the right-hand man of Chicago mob boss Sam Giancana. At the same time, he was also deputy sheriff, or special assistant rather, of the Cook County Sheriff's Department, the number 2 man in the Sheriff's Department. Richard Kane was also a very close associate of Johnny Roselli. Now, Richard Kane up in Chicago, and he operated in Florida as well, was feeding information on the Fair Play for Cuba Committee to the CIA, and thus it was winding up with Phillips. In many ways, as I said, it makes little sense for David Phillips to meet with a potential assassin or patsy in the middle of downtown Dallas. But on the other hand, if Phillips thought that he was meeting with one of our people, somebody whom he's heard from Richard Kane might be willing to go back into Cuba, it makes much more sense. At the same time, this might explain some of Phillips' actions in Mexico City. Perhaps Phillips was legitimately keeping Project Freedom secret from those in the CIA who weren't aware of it. And remember, Project Freedom was not a CIA operation. They were merely supporting it and helping it, and it was known to only a limited number of people in the CIA. And maybe that's why the information out of our Mexico City CIA station was, to put it mildly, all screwed up. Perhaps Phillips had intended to use Oswald as part of one of the unauthorized CIA offshoots of Project Freedom, something like the A.M. Lash operation. and he and others were covering his backside to keep from ruining their careers. Now, there is a lot of evidence that the CIA did keep its own head from knowing about certain operations. Best example is A.M. Lash, Rolando Cubela, CIA agent passing a poison pen to a government official in Cuba. The CIA doesn't know about it. So again, there are some precedents for that. Also, don't forget that the naval intelligence surveillance that the CIA was helping with was going on down in Mexico City. We know that surveillance continued there, and the secrecy surrounding it should also be factored into any assessment of Phillips' activities in Mexico City. Now, this is speculation offered for your consideration and feedback, and again, I just think it needs to be factored in whenever we analyze the activities of David Phillips, but I don't want to really say pro or con, which way I think he might have or might not have been involved. Now, something that's not speculation, something that is fact, is that Tampa threat against John F. Kennedy just a few days before Dallas. And the man was in Tampa at that time with many parallels to Lee Harvey Oswald. As someone asked me earlier, that man was named Gilberto Policarpo Lopez. Now, since last year, we've compiled even more parallels between Gilberto Lopez and Lee Oswald. Some people like Gerald Posner would have you believe Oswald was a very unique, one-of-a-kind individual. Well, he wasn't. This guy has numerous parallels to Oswald. And it's our belief that both of these men, Oswald and Lopez, were part of a massive U.S. effort to beef up American intelligence assets in Cuba in the months before Project Freedom was supposed to occur. Because see, keep in mind, after our embassy had been closed in 61, by 1963, the CIA had very few intelligence assets inside Cuba anymore. Almost none that they could count on for accurate information about the progress of this coup that was supposed to happen at the end of November. Now, because the people they needed couldn't be taken in secretly by boat, they needed people who could freely walk the streets and say, well, yeah, this part of the country's behind the coup, this part of the country isn't, this guy is, thrown in with the coup plotters, this guy's staying loyal to Fidel. They needed people who could walk the streets and see what the general feeling was. So they had to be people who were in Cuba legitimately. They couldn't just sneak them in. So there was a general effort throughout August, September, and October of 1963 by the CIA to get assets inside Cuba. Now, these assets all had something in common. They all had well-documented pro-Castro sympathies, either through demonstrations or nationality, and many had some connection to Russia as well, as did Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, this Russian connection would be important in giving the U.S. deniability in case this low-level asset was ever arrested in Cuba or became involved himself in some dangerous activity. Remember, Castro was getting sort of on the outs with the Russians, and if your low-level asset had a Russian connection somehow, you could say, oh, well, Russians were pulling his strings, not us. But anyway, here are just some, not all, here are some of the parallels between Oswald and Lopez, and think for yourself when I finish, is this coincidence? Or, as Bernard Finsterwald would say, conspiracy? Both men were involved in fistfights that were pro-Castro statements they made in the summer of 1963. Both men went at least one way by car in their Mexico City trip in the fall of 1963. Both men have indications of low-level intelligence activity. Both men are reported by government informants to be at a Fair Play for Cuba Committee gathering in Tampa on November the 17th, 1963. Now that comes as a surprise to some people. But remember, Oswald's whereabouts for the weekend before the assassination are largely unknown. The only reliable information that the government says this informant was reliable places Oswald, or someone pretending to be Oswald, in Tampa, the Sunday before that Tampa motorcade, and scarcely 5 or 6 days before the events in Dallas. But anyway, Lopez is supposed to be at this meeting, and Oswald is supposed to be at that meeting in Tampa. Now, both Oswald and Lopez have Russian connections in their backgrounds. Oswald, as you know, Lopez's was his closest brother was undergoing KGB training at a military installation in Russia in the fall of 1963. So again, if Lopez should ever fall into some problem in Cuba, you could say, well, he was here because his brothers told him to come, and the Russians, not us. Now, both Lopez and Oswald would have made good, deniable, low-level intelligence assets in Cuba because of their Cuba backgrounds. Oswald because of his Fair Play for Cuba Committee membership. Lopez because he was a Fair Play for Cuba Committee member and because he was of Cuban nationality. He'd come to this country in 1959. Now, both Lopez and Oswald had trouble with government documentation that could have made it difficult for them to get employment or to keep employment, and that might have made them amenable to doing things for government agencies that promised to intervene on their behalf. For Oswald, it was his dishonorable discharge. For Lopez, it was his passport that had expired and hadn't been renewed. Now, both men returned to America in the summer of 1962 from a communist country. In the late spring of 1963, both 23-year-olds, Oswald and Lopez, were both 23, and their wives moved to another city where they joined the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. In the summer of 1963, both Oswald and Lopez have some associates who see them as being pro-Castro, while others see them as being anti-Castro. Both men are living in a city where there is much anti-Castro activity. In a city controlled by a mob boss that the House Select Committee will imply was behind JFK's death. And by September of 63, both men are living apart from their wives as a result of supposed marital difficulties. In the fall of 1963, both men cross the border at Nuevo Laredo and make a mysterious trip to Mexico City, where each man is under photographic surveillance by the CIA. Both men are trying to get to Cuba. In the fall of 1963, both men have a job in the vicinity of JFK's motorcade, of JFK's route for a November motorcade. In the week of November 22nd, 1963, both men are in a city where assassination is in the works for JFK. And following the events in Dallas, both men are investigated for their involvement in JFK's assassination. Now again, I think those are just too many parallels to be coincidental. Now the mob made sure that their patsies for the assassination had obvious Cuban connections. The Cuban connection would ensure that Bobby's Cuban contingency plan would go into effect and hopefully provoke an attack on Cuba, which would preclude a quick, thorough investigation. The intelligence contacts of the patsy would ensure additional cover-ups by U.S. intelligence agencies, and we definitely saw that in Oswald's case. Now, it's obvious that Oswald and Lopez were part of the same program to get deniable assets into Cuba in preparation for Project Freedom. But again, they were one of dozens of people, but they were crucial ones. In the case of Oswald, the mob made it look like he had turned, and his background made him the instant best suspect in Dallas. In the case of Lopez, he left Dallas, crossed the border, flew to Cuba immediately after the assassination, and for all we know, Gilberto Lopez may still be there. But even if anything had happened to Oswald to prevent him from being the patsy, we know of at least one other person in this case, Gilberto Lopez, who would have been the ideal substitute. Now, much of the story about Project Freedom and the Cuba contingency plan and the mob's role in JFK's death is known only by a small number of people. For the associates of John Kennedy, his death was very, very painful, and it's still difficult for many of them to deal with and talk about today. Most of them were elderly and in ill health, and we cannot reveal their identities because of pledges of confidentiality we made to them. Plus, some of them still have secrecy oaths that they still have to take into consideration with various government agencies. Now, others in the government who know parts of the story are also bound by national security considerations. And also, too, remember that the family and associates of JFK's Cuban allies for Project Freedom, the family and associates of those people who were going to work with JFK in Cuba, a lot of those people are still in Cuba. The family and associates are still alive, and their identities and their lives would be at risk if certain identities were revealed even today. Now, in some cases, we've uncovered the identity of agents like QJ Wynn, but since he's still alive, it's against the law for us to reveal his identity to you. And we know far more about Project Freedom and the Mafia plan to kill JFK than we've been able to share with you today. So how do we tell you this story? Well, as Tom explained, only by writing a carefully documented, historically accurate novel can we tell you the whole story. Now, one reason we're sharing all this information with you today, when we have really nothing to gain, we have no book to sell or anything like that, is to give you new directions for your research. Everything we've told you is a legitimate area of inquiry, and you should look for additional information on the record and from private sources like we did. There are other areas where we feel research may be very, very fruitful, and that's in the areas of Gilberto Lopez, Michael Mertz, Miguel Casas, John Martino, Alberto Fowler, Miguel Cruz, and the Cuban exiles who were working for Traficante in 1963. Now, Anthony Summers did a great job discovering new information about Martino and Fowler just this year, but there's much more to be learned. Now, the flood of declassified documents we're all getting now is remarkable, and we can confirm that a half dozen references to Project Freedom have already slipped through among the thousands that have been released. And those are just the ones we know about. We haven't yet been able to evaluate all the declassified documents. That'd be a full-time job. And there are many more we just haven't seen yet. But I encourage you to look for those references. Now, we encourage you to support COPA in their efforts to ensure the review board gets to fulfill its purpose. I want you to fight for every document and scrap of paper that you can get, because the more we get, the more that comes out, the more they're going to have to release, and it'll become a nice cycle that's going to perpetuate itself, and eventually the full story will be able to come out. I mean, as we've shown, it's remarkable what slipped through, which is itself a sign that the government as a whole wasn't really behind JFK's death. But don't overlook what's already out there, like we did for several years. Knowing what you know now, go back and look at those things in a new light. We're sure you'll find things that we've missed. If you have any interest at all in what Tom and I have been talking about today, I urge you to go out and buy Deadly Secrets by Hinkle and Turner. It's the only book that really deals with even small parts of Project Freedom. In fact, the original edition of that work, called The Fish is Red, which took us a year to find, was crucial to leading Tom and I to key players in this operation. And by the way, I knew that Karen Shaw had a copy of that for sale in the A.S.K. and it's a great book that it's not exactly like Deadly Secrets. There are differences between the two books. Now, to sum up, the folks who try to pin the assassination and the cover-up only on Lee Harvey Oswald, or those who posit huge conspiracies involving Castro and other improbable masterminds, are unintentionally doing what Traficante and Marcello had hoped for back in 1963. As I said last year, there was a conspiracy at work on November 22nd, 1963, and Robert Kennedy had a name for that conspiracy. Robert Kennedy called it the Syndicate. Today we call it organized crime. Finally, in the face of threats from Jimmy Hoffa and all of his mob allies, John and Robert Kennedy never backed down. They pressed on with their battle against organized crime and to bring democracy to Cuba. Now, John Kennedy paid the ultimate price, and before Robert Kennedy was in a position to expose the truth, he was cut down too. Now, if you believe in what they stood for, and would any of us be here today if we didn't, I urge you to continue their work and to continue looking into these areas. Thank you.
I think A.S.K. will let us have a little bit more time. If some of you would like to use the mic, I'll set it up right now.
Thanks.
Lamar mentioned the Vanity Fair article by Anthony Summers is having a lot of good new material. That's finally arrived in the bookstore. It's Original Magazine and Bookstore. It's about a block down on Main Street. In addition, there's two other magazines that just came in. One is Video Toaster User, which has a cover story about computer animation work in the Kennedy assassination. The other magazine is the latest Texas Monthly, with an interview with Lady Bird Johnson, which has a discussion of the Kennedy assassination.
Lamar, I was wondering how you interpret Robert Kennedy's remark, supposedly to Ruiz Williams, that one of your guys did it. Where does that fit in?
Well, I believe if you look closely at the Vanity Fair article and at the writing that Haynes Johnson has done about that over the years, and if you read Deadly Secrets, Bobby Kennedy did not make that comment to Ruiz Williams as detailed in the Vanity Fair article. There were two men in the room, Ruiz Williams and Haynes Johnson, the Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter for the Washington Post. And Bobby made the comment to Haynes Johnson, who has written about it himself. And I urge you to seek those articles out. Haynes Johnson, I'm paraphrasing this, Haynes Johnson's explanation, which I feel obliged to share with you folks, is that Bobby was under the mistaken impression at the time that Oswald was an anti-Castro activist. And Bobby knew that Haynes Johnson had been working closely with the Bay of Pigs leaders on his book called The Bay of Pigs, which again I urge you to get. It came out in 1964 by Haynes Johnson and several leaders of the Bay of Pigs. So Haynes Johnson's explanation is Bobby mistakenly thought at the time that Oswald was an anti-Castro activist and that he was connected somehow to these Cuban leaders, Cuban exile leaders that Haynes Johnson was working with, most of whom were involved with Project Freedom. And that's Haynes Johnson's explanation for that comment. I would probably want to leave it at that at this point. It raises interesting questions. At what point did people in the government think that Oswald was an anti-Castro activist? Again, if you buy our theory about Lopez and Oswald being one of many people the CIA was trying to get into Cuba, that makes sense. But again, I think I'd leave it at that, but I urge you to seek out those other sources I mentioned.
I'd like to thank you first for a thought-provoking talk, one of the most provocative talks I've heard in a long time. I have three... Talk a little louder. Sorry. I want to ask a couple of brief questions. Let me just ask them first, and you can respond to them. First, sorry. The first involves the Veciana-Oswald, Maurice Bishop meeting, if it occurred. One of the things that's most puzzling about that is why an intelligence officer like Phillips would meet two agents in public. It's not just that he met Oswald in public, but that he allowed one agent to see the other. It doesn't seem to make sense unless he intended for one to see the other. The second question has to do with the Chicago attempt on November 2nd. There seem to be two that are reported in the literature, as was alluded to earlier, the Thomas Valley, and then the four men who were perhaps part of a Cuban operation. What's the connection among them? And we put Valley on the same list with Lee Harvey Oswald and Lopez. And then the third question is, how, on your scenario, would the interest in Angleton's counterintelligence special operation group that was revealed in the Lopez report and that Peter Dale Scott talks about in his introduction to that, how would the Angleton's group's interest in Oswald before the assassination fit into the larger picture that you're describing?
Okay, you may have to prompt me if I forget those questions. They were all very good. I'll take them as I remember them. One on the Chicago thing, remember that Thomas Valley wasn't really, he didn't really try to kill President Kennedy. He was riding around, sure, he was an ex-Marine, and Bill Adams has done some work that placed Valley in interesting places where JFK was earlier in the year. But he was more of an extremist. He had a carload of weapons, but it's not like he ever seriously tried to do anything to President Kennedy. So I think he's more of I don't want to say distraction, but I think a very peripheral interest to these activities. And again, he's been pretty thoroughly investigated over the years. Bill Adams is doing some good new work, and maybe we'll see something. But again, the more serious threat were the four people. They have some names in common with the people in Dallas. They had guns, they were near the overpass. They were the ones who the Chicago reporters were ordered not to write about, and indeed, as they told Bud Finsterwald in 1968, 4 different reporters said, okay, we knew about it, but we didn't write about it. As for Angleton's interest in, I guess going back to the Veciana meeting with Bishop and Oswald, I can give you some speculation on that. Number one, because of various security concerns, where is David Atlee Phillips or Maurice Bishop going to meet with his agents? I know I've been in situations talking with sources close to the Kennedys and intelligence people where we would talk out in public because you couldn't talk in the car, couldn't talk in the hotel room. The phone had started making real funny sounds. You didn't want to go to their office, didn't want to have them come to my office. So again, a public place like that can be a pretty safe place to meet, at least you're not being bugged. There have been people who have speculated that, who knows, maybe the purpose of that meeting was to get Veciana seen in connection with Oswald. That has a lot of interesting implications to it as well. Poor Veciana, who was also told to contact, I think, a relative he had at the Cuban embassy and try to set him up. Imagine Veciana's in a place where here he's seen meeting with Oswald, and then he's contacting someone at the Cuban embassy. Again, if they needed if everybody else had been in a car wreck and they needed a patsy, Veciana would have been in a very, very rough position. So again, those are my speculations there. As for Angleton's interest in the Mexico City operations, John Newman, I think, is going to provide us all the ultimate answers to those questions when his book comes out. Again, keep in mind several things. The CIA at the highest levels was very worried that they had been penetrated by a Soviet mole. So they were compartmentalizing things to a great degree. If indeed Oswald and Lopez and those guys were a very low-level part of beefing up our security apparatus or intelligence apparatus in Cuba for Project Freedom, that was something you could never afford to have a Soviet mole in the CIA find out. So again, they would have that kind of consideration, and that can explain perhaps why, one cable would say one thing, one cable going to a different division would say another. Also, everyone in the CIA didn't know about Project Freedom. Several key people did, but others didn't. So again, you've got that compartmentalization. Finally, Angleton did have counterintelligence, and again, they could have had concerns even at that point. It would almost be logical if they did, that something funny was going on with Oswald. And, here Oswald was supposedly, according to some people, one of our guys working for us, but he had some unusual contacts that they knew, the CIA hadn't authorized. So again, you have to look at it from that context, that perhaps the CIA had suspicions about Oswald even then. If they did, and they didn't act on them, and this man is later accused of killing the president, what's the CIA going to do? They're going to cover that up. So I think, did I answer all the questions? Or George Michael, do you have any additional?
Yeah, I think your Angleton question points up where I don't part company, but see with enormous respect and a feeling of great gratefulness for the work that Tom and Lamar have done and will continue to do, that it's a truncated, for me, formula, and that I will maintain again, I think I said it 2 years ago here, that, and I said it, by the way, when the only time a researcher has been able to broadcast out of, by long distance, the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. I was on a show several years ago, and they broadcast through it. And the last question was, and I knew it was coming, who killed John F. Kennedy? And I talked about Washington power brokers and sending the contract through mediators, principally but not exclusively, Hoffa as a major mediation, and getting the shooters from organized crime with very strong drug connections. I think the Angleton connection is central again. I mean, you have to solve that equation. And that has to do with Angleton's ultimately fascist, anti-communist, OSS, Central Intelligence, drug traffic protecting behavior that he saw needed to be protected immediately. And that's why I continue to feel that, for example, I have some lines to it that Santo Traficante's connections will ultimately also be perceived as a Federal Bureau of Narcotics connection. Now, one thing, by the way, you must look for, and I think Lamar knows this, if you know that someone has been turned, invert the term and muddy the information. Let's say that Santo Traficante has been working for the Central Intelligence Agency or as an asset, that he has an FBN connection, then make very certain that what you say about him and get it circulating, and it's been circulated by CIA assets, that he was a Castro asset. Got it? Now, if you take Castro's name out of that and put in Cuba, and if you put Cuban narcotics asset, then you see that the story's correct. But he, as far as I can tell, had no direct connection, though there have been anecdotal stuff on this. Just because Nicolas Cage says it doesn't have to be true, and just because it's published in the Washington Post doesn't automatically make it so. The Valley, and for other stories, I think you covered that more than adequately. David Atlee Phillips, Vesiana, and the Oswald lookalike. And I say that because I have always had a very strong suspicion that that was one of the Oswald lookalikes, number one. Number two, I strongly suspected that it may be John Thomas Mason. And number three, and we've talked about this, if you've got an operation, maybe we have, but I know you know what I'm talking. If you have an operation going, don't let anyone leave with half a courier bag. Put something else in it. If you're going to bomb Laos and Cambodia secretly, don't bring empty planes back. Have them land and fill up on heroin and take that back. In other words, double up your operation. It's a standard procedure. Got it? So if you say, is it possible that this had something to do with A, when Phillips and Vesiana and the Oswald met together, or is it B? My answer is maybe yes. In other words, both of them may be operating at the same time, because you might always want to use the fact that Vesiana was in touch with an Oswald or Oswald lookalike for some future purpose. Thank you, John.
Yeah, I guess one thing, I'm real glad that you mentioned John Thomas Mason, because even though I have to point out Veciana and Mason have both denied it, there is an FBI document that indicates that Antonio Veciana was trying to buy arms from John Thomas Mason in Dallas in the summer.
And that's in Dallas, and therefore the connection.
Yeah, and for those of you who don't know, John Thomas Mason was identified by Treasury Agent Frank Ellsworth as being an almost exact double of Oswald. But again, we've queried Veciana directly, and he denies it, and so does Mason. But I still think it's a possibility that should definitely be looked at. I'm glad you mentioned that.
When Dick Russell examined the John Thomas Mason story published in the Village Voice, at the same time I was doing work, and remarkably, I came at it at the other direction, and I therefore, in effect, deconstructed the Russell story and found it led me to places where Dick didn't realize it was going to go, and we found, myself and a student at the University of Hartford, found still other connections that we thought were remarkable. The longest piece, therefore, yet publicly written about John Thomas Mason is in And We Are All Mortal. But Carol Hewitt at COPA has new documents on John Thomas Mason, and she gave an excellent presentation at COPA and may publish, I'm not certain. But in any case, if you want to look at the John Thomas Mason story, and a rather dense set of relationships that may include the 3126 Harlandale, the meeting of the anti-Castro Cubans, and the fact that it's the sheriff's office, was aware of an Oswald meeting with anti-Castro Cubans, and Ellsworth says, no, that wasn't Oswald, that was my Oswald lookalike that was meeting with him. No, that wasn't Oswald, that was my Oswald lookalike firing at all the ranges. Now, that only increases by some kind of magnification level, not arithmetic, but multiplicative, the John Thomas Mason story. By explaining the story, you invest it with extraordinary authority. So we're triangulating now in an area that is very rich and with a number of people working on it. The John Thomas Mason story and its connections to half a dozen leads, major leads, still would be fully explored in the assassination of John F. Kennedy.
Thanks.
I also want to thank this panel for a very thought-provoking presentation. I have a question for Lamar. Can you identify persons who were killed in the Bay of Pigs invasion who were connected with the mob or personally related to Tropicante or Marcello?
People who were killed in the Bay of Pigs invasion?
People who were killed in the Bay of Pigs.
The best source, because I've got a lot of stuff in my databases, the source I use for most of my Bay of Pigs veterans informations is Gordon Winslow down in Miami.
Yes, I was going to say exactly. That's a
yeah,
Gordon Winslow question.
He's maintained all of those files. I'm curious why you're interested about the people who were killed at the Bay of Pigs as opposed to who survived.
Well, there's some additional research.
Yeah, because I can say there are in the National Archives now, for people who survived the Bay of Pigs, they have released the debriefing reports where the Bay of Pigs prisoners, through the efforts of Bobby Kennedy and some a Cuban national and one of his people who later worked on Project Freedom, when they got the Bay of Pigs prisoners out, they were debriefed by the CIA. And those reports are now getting declassified. They're in horrible condition, but it is interesting that there are some mafia discussions, and these prisoners give opinions of their fellow prisoners, and it's quite interesting what they have to say about, in some cases, organized crime connections about
I'd like to look into that further.
If John Thomas Mason, if Vestiano was trying to buy arms from John Thomas Mason, wouldn't he know that it was John Thomas Mason rather than Oswald? Why would there be confusion between the two by Vestiano in that case?
Well, that's what Veciana says. He says, I knew who Mason was, and I knew this was Oswald, and again, I wouldn't want to cast doubt on the credibility of any of those people, but again, I think it's just a possibility that always does have to be looked at, because again, you do have the Oswald lookalike Indiciana linked in that FBI documents talking about buying arms in Dallas around that same time.
Yeah, excellent question, and it may be, in fact, that Vestiana needs to say that, and that's another part of a rather dense relationship. But you know what happened when Gaetan took him to David Atlee Phillips. I am certain that the two men are looking at one, and each of them know absolutely who they are. They are friends and have worked with each other. So I think the deception is operating.
A comment, and I'm not really sure. I was sitting back there trying to figure out how I was going to word this. As a researcher for 26 years and read some 500 X amount of books and articles, I have a rough time, even though that I don't know all the intricacies and all the different layers and levels of what has been told here, and I still have more research to do, and as do most of us. A comment from last year, we were exposed by the KGB and told that the KGB, Neprachenko, that we must believe him because this is now the absolute truth. And I sat back there at that particular time wondering, I go, for years we don't believe what the CIA has put out. We don't believe what the Secret Service has put out. We don't believe what the FBI comes out. And then all of a sudden, boom, we have Neprachenko comes in, and now we're going to take KGB. Okay? Now, to get to my other statement is I have a rough time trying to figure out how the United States government is going to parallel or solicit a cover for something that Bobby Kennedy and John Kennedy in this Project Freedom, which we actually don't know the actual name of, and they're going to cover that up to protect their interests. And I understand that there's a lot more to this, but as a researcher, I'm going to have a rough time going through that, trying to explain that, as I tried to explain for the past 25 or 26 years how in the hell the Mannlicher Carcano became the Mannlicher Carcano. And it's difficult, and I know there's a lot of research to do up there, but as 26 years, it's tough.
Lamar?
2 points I'd like to make, because again, I sympathize with you greatly. You've been at this longer than I have. But 2 points to keep in mind about why the government has had to keep this so secret for so long. Something I was talking about with George Michael recently. While Project Freedom, for all intents and purposes, ended as a major operation when John Kennedy was murdered and Lyndon Johnson decided to make his stand in Vietnam instead of Cuba, parts of it continued. The people in the Cuban government stayed in place. They, as far as we know, weren't discovered. So there was always that hope. I'm certain when Bobby Kennedy was running for president that he had, that operation was still there to be revived. We know that part of Project Freedom was taken by people like David Atlee Phillips, and some of that exact plan for a coup was applied in Chile in the early 1970s. We know that as late as the time of the House Select Committee, one of the coup plotters in Cuba met with a high person in the Carter administration. See, so again, I don't think anybody in 1963 thought Castro, of all the dictators in the world then, would still be alive and in power today. But he is. And so it's always been a choice on the part of the government and certain agencies, and I think the president, we can blow this operation and dig into this thing and maybe find something, maybe not, or we can keep our secret Cuba card, and that continued, like I say, at least through the time of the House Select Committee, which is why things had to be kept from the House Select Committee. So about the only encouraging word I can give you, though, is, and they probably said this 20 years ago, Castro can't live and last forever. And it really does look like we're closer now than ever to seeing his fall. And after his fall, when it wouldn't mean the death of people in Cuba, family and associates of those people who were working with the Kennedys, I think, I know we're going to be able to say a lot more on the record nonfiction that we can share with you now. So that's my only word of encouragement, that it's not, I'm not going to be like Earl Warren and say, not within your lifetime. Because I don't think, Castro's going to outlive you. So I think there is going to come a time, and probably just a few years away after the fall of Castro, when a lot of this is going to get to come out on the record.
Yeah, good. That was, for me, first-class response, and because it spoke to concerns that I have. Let me see if I can straighten this out in terms of my response. I didn't speak to some evidence in terms of the interim report and the final report that surfaced in a very careful statement made about the recommendations that the U.S. federal programs, experimental programs, be shut down and 2 major hospitals be shut down. I know, and I've got to get more on this, that threatened directly the possible exposure of artichoke and MK Ultra. But it's not as clear as you heard me do the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and all of its construction. Now, that leads me to something that neither I think Lamar nor I can talk about, but that we both are working on, and that is, remarkably, alternate patsies. It becomes very clear that for some time, alternate patsies were being set up. At least some or one close in Dallas and close to Lee Harvey Oswald, with much more detail than has been presently given. Now, if that's so, then one of the things I want to do in the next year or so is to make a matrix and then say, what is the catalytic agency or the catalytic moment when you choose the patsy whose connections allow for the most loss? Got it? That is, who's the patsy who will carry such a federal, corporate, organized crime, drug, and it's like you finally move in on that patsy. And I think, therefore, that increasingly the things that we're doing outside of our work, the MK Ultra secret work, the Russell work now on behavior modification, etc., and the 2 Oswalds, or the development of 2 real Oswalds, all suggest that as the catalytic moments, like for example the March to April '63 Kennedy administration stuff, that whatever Project Freedom is one of the factors. MK Ultra is another one of the factors. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics and its narcotics nexus is one of the factors. And then finally, there are very few patsies left to choose from who can carry that total burden. The other thing is, and I think Lamar has to hear this and we'll be talking about it, is I don't buy the Robert Kennedy directed autopsy operation. I don't care if you have a witness to it. It is and this is a gut feeling, and I am certain, but I have it only anecdotally, that Berkeley's talking to someone other than Robert Kennedy. But I really am very interested in the man who is present as a representative, all right? Now, there's no secret that I and Kathy Lee Cunningham and Kathy Fitzgerald and Harrison Livingston and who knows, probably Lamar, want to know who Dr. Bateman or Dr. Bateman is at the autopsy. And I can tell you, if we all sat down for about an hour, you would find the most fantastic investigatory history amounting to nothing through at least 2 countries with enormous amounts of work done. But maybe one of us might have a sliver or something. I have a feeling that name may very well be a cover term for someone other than a doctor who was allowed to be there in a mask, in whatever, representing someone or something. And so it may very well be that we're talking about the same kinds of things. But I repeat, I don't buy the Robert Kennedy connection.
I want to thank the panel and your absent colleague, Mr. Hartman. Fascinating presentation. Mr. Evica just took some of my words away when he said he didn't buy the Robert Kennedy controlling the autopsy scenario. I find that highly implausible, especially when other participants in the autopsy and in the autopsy room have gone public years ago. about what happened in the autopsy room, and I find it extremely difficult to accept that Robert Kennedy, who, according to all sources I have read, was in a state of almost shock for quite a period of time after this, was mentally capable of directing what went on in the autopsy room. And so I wanted to throw that out, that I find that to be implausible, and agreeing with Mr. Evica. But one other question.
That's nice to have someone agree with me.
I understand you're formulating all of this into a novel. My question is, are your manuscripts available for distribution, what you've used here in Mr. Hartman today?
The ones that we read from?
I beg your pardon?
I'm sorry, which manuscript?
The ones that you've been using here today.
No, I'm afraid not. But again, I would again refer you to the A.S.K people, because I think they're going to have audio tapes and videotapes available.
That's right.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Fascinating.
I would like to go ahead and address the autopsy just real quickly, because it's fun to debate, and I'm sure George Michael and I will talk about this a lot. But I do want to add one point of clarification. When I said Bobby Kennedy was calling the shots at the autopsy, obviously, he's not a trained medical person, and certain things have to happen. But with respect to national security considerations, and of course there were personal family things that didn't want to come out at the autopsy too, his word was followed. And the one thing I just encourage you all to think about is, again, who wound up with a lot of that important evidence? Who wound up with the brain? And that was Bobby Kennedy.
We're about an hour overdue, but we'll take. Thank you very much. No, just stay up there.
Well, I'm sorry to be redundant about it, but I think one of the reasons that I in particular focus on being very willing to think that the government is going to do something and less willing to think that Robert Kennedy is that you're giving Robert Kennedy the opportunity to punish his brother's killers and crush the mob, or worry about Cuba. And it strikes me that would be at least the third least important thing. He would be most upset about his brother, and I think he has a much longer personal issue with the mob than he does with Cuba.
I'm glad you raised that point, because it's one we raised to people close to Bobby. But as they pointed out, and these were people we're talking to who have extensive organized crime backgrounds, look at how hard it was for Bobby to prosecute Jimmy Hoffa, for him to prosecute Carlos Marcello. He couldn't do it. While Bobby was Attorney General, he couldn't get Carlos Marcello in a jail. Marcello bribed the juror. Look how long it took Jimmy Hoffa from the time he first came to the attention of the Kennedys in the mid-50s, till he finally went to jail. As we've had it explained to us, Bobby knew that prosecuting the highest levels of the mafia was just about an impossibility, and would take months and years of hard digging. Now you have this other problem too. You're making a lot of progress against the mafia. You're the big crime fighter. You've got hundreds of cases against major mafia figures. If it comes out that the Attorney General of the United States believes the mafia, specific individuals or as a general group, were in any way connected with the death of his brother, what does it do to all of those cases going to grand juries, going to juries? You've just given every mafia lawyer in the country their ticket to freedom. Yeah. So again, we have to temper those very things you thought, which are the things that I thought and struggled with, until again I had very experienced Justice Department people explain to me how hard it would have been for him to prosecute those people. He knew it would be just about impossible. And he knew too, he didn't control the FBI anymore. He didn't get to control the Bureau of Narcotics anymore. He didn't get to control the CIA anymore. Once his brother was dead, he knew the kind of investigation it would take to even for those prosecutions to have a chance. That was beyond his scope. His hated enemy, LBJ, was president. One can only speculate what was in Bobby Kennedy's mind, though we know from a couple of comments when he was running for president, and he did make a comment to one associate, he didn't want to reopen the Warren Commission, because if Bobby Kennedy were president, he at least would be able to coordinate that kind of investigation, and one could hope that perhaps he would have pursued that had he lived.
And remember the 20 people on trial on narcotics arrests and indictments in the New York City thing in October. And when it became absolutely crystal clear that that was the major target of the Kennedys, and that it would continue through October and into November, and that the vehicle of the attack, the last major vehicle of the attack, they already knew about the interim report, was in fact the narcotics hearings. Those lawyers moved for immediately through 3 separate channels to get that trial postponed. And I agree with Lamar. Once that would come out, the entire structure of arrest and indictment and even convictions possibly the place would be in absolute turmoil. One other thing, Robert Kennedy seems to me one of the most complex human beings in the 20th century. Fierce, conservative, Catholic, almost puritanical, almost a kind of mystical religious force, anti-communist, and a good many of the edges on all those ideas were reforged in the crucible of his life from November 22nd, 63 through 68. I think in many ways, oddly enough, we had the chance to live with for 5 years one of the finest human beings that ever walked the earth. And tragically, it was in good part because of the death of his own of his president and brother. So there are terrible ironies involved here. And the unraveling of all these things that Robert was carrying with him from way before, from the 50s, from his association with Roy Cohn and McCarthy. I mean, I'm just beginning to do work on McCarthy and Pepsi-Cola and back to Yassigian's book, The Cola Wars, realizing that we must try to understand the complex psychosocial forces that were operating at the time, and how there could be bad anti-communism and good anti-communism that ran through the souls of very good people. So I would say suspend judgment and keep on looking. And for me, my love for both men who died, I think in the pursuit of truth and justice, is increasing over the years, Robert and John.
Okay, I got a good question, I think. Is Operation Freedom Action, the guy that said it was under, Tom Hartman said it was under a lot of names. Was it under Operation Mongoose too?
No, that was totally separate. This came after Mongoose. When they canned Mongoose. Well, now, Second Naval Guerrilla has been applied. Remember I said there were the 5 exile leaders and groups involved? That Artemi, Pepe San Ramon operation operating out of Central America. Now that, I've seen, and Tad Schulz, I think, coined it, has called that Second Naval Guerrilla. It may even date back to 1965 when that name came out for the first time. So that's the term, we use for Artemi's part in the research community. However, I've talked to people involved, and that's a term not known to them. So that may have been a term coined at some point by some exile or journalist, because again, as we fought for so long, we didn't have a name for any of this thing. So again, I don't think you'll see that in official documents. James McCord, I've just found out, wrote the CIA in the late 70s saying, this is before The Fish is Red came out, but when Tad Schulz had talked about Second Naval Guerrilla and had said, I want any CIA documents about me, because McCord was CIA, about Second Naval Guerrilla or my involvement in it. I don't remember that term. I don't think. And the CIA wrote him back and said, well, Mr. McCord, we don't have any record of any operation called Second Naval Guerrilla.
Yeah. One of the things I think you have to realize, I'm not making a dime on it, but Andrea All Mortal has a very long section on the Watergate connection. Peter Dale Scott long ago knew that there was a direct connection between Dallas and Watergate. Lamar and I have talked about this, and we know there's a Dallas-Watergate connection. And I gave him some titles suggesting very strongly that forces that we're talking about were inside the Nixon administration for the very same reasons, and it's not impossible, I think we both agree, that the Nixon presidency, regardless of the crimes he committed, was brought down for reasons quite similar to what happened on November 22nd, 63. Now, I haven't talk to Walt. But I'm afraid his very unique look at Watergate is going to turn out to be the 5th version of the same story that at least four of us are already working on and have worked on. You've been a marvelous audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You did a great job. Great job keeping things moving. There. We did okay.
The high-level context, I know you can't come in the dark, but I have one, and I can't tell you who it is.
I can understand that.
But we should, and I'm going to be ranging.
Informally, this is the last session of the 1994 Assassination Symposium on John F. Kennedy, and I can tell you I love the Adolphus. I'm moving in. I know what part of it is my living room and what's the dining room, and I've tested the pianos, and pianos, plural. I have a beautiful little upright at home. Forget it, I'm not shipping it. I'm just going to have these pianos. Marvelous. I walked alone to Dealey Plaza this morning, visited the memorial, and again, I find Commerce Street one of the coldest streets in the world. So when I walk back on Elm, which oddly enough is a warmer street. But as one of you said, that boy, the wind whips down that street. The memorial needs cleaning up. I think it's a shame that Parks and Recreation didn't get out there and just sweep it. And since I saw it last, there's an interesting tradition, and John Goldsmith will find this interesting. Coins are now being placed or thrown on the flat slab at the memorial, which, by the way, is an ancient folk ceremony of remembrance. The tradition of dropping coins in wells and springs and giving coins to the dead, placing coins on the eye, are all in the either certain belief or in the hope of resurrection. I thought you would find that, therefore, extraordinary, that with some kind of inner belief that the spirit of John F. Kennedy will rise again, that people are now placing coins at the memorial just a few blocks away from where those bullets felled him. If you get a chance, read the back of the fence. It's not an easy thing to do. I wept this morning. It is a most moving experience to read the graffiti in praise of John F. Kennedy. And a good deal of it has to do with, again, memorializing an idea and a spirit that will not die. So please check it out, and this time, just go along the fence. And as I said, read the fence. We have to ask a newcomer, Dr. John Goldsmith, who is am I getting it right? The chair of the Linguistics Department, University of Chicago, and he acts as a reader for the University of Chicago Press. I met John through the press, and we corresponded, and we were together for a while at the COPA conference, and then again we renewed our friendship here at A.S.K. I think some of you now know John, and many of the researchers now do, and so I asked if he wouldn't join us and make some comments about principally, but not exclusively, the consensus statement, and then possibly, if he would like, about both the COPA and A.S.K. conferences. So with no further ado, this is Dr. John Goldsmith a researcher and writer who has work in progress. I think it'll be probably the best textbook on the assassination that will get into print. John Goldsmith.
George Michael, I thought I was going to respond to some things that you were going to say this morning, but that's okay. I have some remarks here that I've written up or written down, and I'll share them with you. The consensus statement. George Michael has drafted a consensus statement which appears on page 15 and 16. I must be one of those feedback people. I haven't been before. You've drafted a consensus statement which I suspect and expect that you all have read. And I wanted to make some comments on it, not so much on the specific sentences that are there or the paragraphs, but on some of the ideas that lie behind it. First of all, there's the very notion of consensus and what the notion of consensus might mean among a group of skeptics. Because if there's one thing that unites us all and that brings us here, it's this peculiar, or at least statistically peculiar characteristic of skepticism. Maybe we're more skeptical than people in general or more skeptical than the average American. But whatever it is, we're a lot more skeptical than most people. We're the sort of people who listen to the president on TV or actually pick up a newspaper and read it and don't necessarily believe it and have reasons, in fact, for disbelief frequently. So what could it possibly mean to put together a statement of consensus among skeptics? It could really mean only one thing. It's a document that's been produced that we can sit there and be skeptical about.
Which, by the way,
It's exactly what has happened, exactly, right. And we have to bear that in mind. And so my reflections, my thoughts this morning are all targeted to that fundamental question: how can we put together a statement of consensus? Why would you even want to put together a statement of consensus among a group of skeptics? It's like having a meeting for a bunch of procrastinators, exactly, and calling for the meeting to start at 9 a.m. The skepticism, though, that we have, and we certainly don't want to get rid of it. If anything, we want to encourage it. The skepticism that we have ought to be an intellectual skepticism and an informed skepticism, and not a moral skepticism. It shouldn't be a skepticism that leads to apathy or inaction. It should be a willingness to check the facts. That's certainly the very first characteristic, and to look behind the facts, which is even more important. And it should be a willingness and a need, a drive to rearrange the facts, to look for additional significance. And this can always happen at any moment. Significance that had been missed in all the variations tried up to that moment, an additional significance can arise out of the blue. One rearranges the letters on the board, and all of a sudden a new image comes into focus. In reading the consensus statement that I have in front of me, and again, I'll say this some more, but I'll say it now, I strongly urge you to read it and even try your own hand at drafting a consensus statement. The question we can ask is the study of the Kennedy assassination a study of the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee? And to some extent, it seems to me that George Michael's statement suggests that this is the case. For those who have been actively working in this field for 2 or 3 decades, it may seem like an obvious truism that the lion's share of the effort has been to engage in battle, both intellectual battle and moral battle, with officialdom. And that battle continues today in a new guise with the armament that's offered by the law that throws open the assassination documents. Although we've heard very sound reasons and sound statements from people who are already working with Thunheim and his colleagues. And these people, I think like John Newman, have urged us to show judicious and prudent restraint in criticizing the work of the President's Committee before we have a solid record of their work and their judgment. And I certainly share the judgment that we should begin with an optimistic and hopeful view of what will happen over the next, nearly 3 years. It seems to me that the role of the study of the Warren Commission has changed over the years. I've been interested in the Kennedy assassination for, nearly 20 years. I've only become active in meetings of this sort in the last 2 years or so. So to some extent, I've been watching things change over time, and to some extent, I'm a new person to the discussion. Perhaps my view is a minoritarian one. Perhaps it's difficult to find a consensus on the matter being the role of the Warren Commission and how that role has changed in our discussions and our thoughts over the years. But frankly, it seems to me pointless to study the faults and the omissions of the Warren Commission and the Warren Commission report at this point, some 30 years now after its publication. The most interesting work now concerning the Warren Commission, it seems to me, is a work that explores it as a historical document. There's really little point, I think, in studying it and making moral judgments about what did or didn't happen, what the Warren Commission did or didn't do. I'm sure everyone who attended his presentation, I was very impressed by John Armstrong's work, which I heard here and heard last month at the COPA meeting. And Armstrong, as you know, in his presentation, did two things. He searched through the Warren Commission documents and found traces of two historical Oswalds. But then he did something very important as well, which seems to me is characteristic or emblematic of what the Warren Commission materials can do for us. And that is, he used these documents as a springboard for further current action, and he got in touch with people who were able to shed light in ways that they hadn't with their interviews with the FBI and the Warren Commission staff itself. And he went ahead and did such things as called the IRS to find out when a tax number on the W-2s that had been in Oswald's Dallas police archives, when those tax numbers were issued. And that's a really remarkable part of his presentation. And it's a very positive way in which to speak to the work of the Warren Commission. It's remarkable that the 26 supporting volumes of the Warren Commission work were published. That's a remarkable fact in and of itself, and it's still serving as a rich soil in which ideas can take root and grow. Well, what would it mean to put together a consensus based on positive sentiments and positive statements? There's two notions that seem to me that can serve as a backdrop to the discussion. The first factor is to recognize that there is a de facto consensus here that deserves to be made explicit. And this is particularly striking to me as someone with an academic background. I'm in linguistics, as George Michael mentioned. I am in the field of linguistics, and linguistics is really no different than any other academic field, and it's split into different theories, and different people who subscribe to different theories subscribe to different journals, go to different meetings, and in many respects do their best to ignore each other's work. And that's not at all healthy. It's not healthy at all. And this, by and large, is not representative, is not present among assassination researchers. Certainly there's a range of opinions, and that's just a mark of health. Who was responsible for the assassination? Certainly there's not a consensus. Was it Marcello and Trafficante? Was it elements high enough up in the U.S. government who could pull the strings needed to manage the cover-up that we all know? There's no disagreement. There's no agreement on whether Oswald was a heroic figure or was he a figure who was manipulated from the word go, no more and no less. These questions and the answers that we give to them highlight differences of opinion, but the fact is that no matter what your opinion or your working hypothesis is, there's no research that you can afford to ignore, and no research that won't have some bearing on the larger picture of the assassination that you create for yourself. And the proof of this fact, if any is needed, is the high attendance found at virtually all of the substantive sessions throughout this meeting. So that's one initial consensus. There's a difference of opinion and emphasis, but a remarkably broad range of agreement. I think it's somewhat ironic that the one area where there's little consensus and little agreement is probably that of regarding the work of Jim Garrison, what the role is of his theories. And the irony, of course, is that it was Oliver Stone's movie based on the Garrison story that created so much, rekindled interest in the Kennedy assassination in this country. The other striking feature of the researchers here is the remarkable heterogeneity of the people committed to this work. Where can we find groups with such a remarkable range of backgrounds? We have educators who work at all levels. We have research physicists. We have doctors. We have lawyers. We have people who are devoted to raising families at home. We have it all. And by and large, in accepting such arcane areas of specialization as nuclear activation analysis, we're all equal in this enterprise. And that's a truly remarkable fact. Finally, what may be the most important point of consensus and agreement here is that the assassination of John F. Kennedy is important to us because it remains a fruitful and productive source of insights. And for whatever the reason, we find that we're not here simply rehashing the same old things. Each year there are important findings and astonishing revelations and interesting new books and documents to read. We've known for a long time, too, that there are important connections between the Kennedy assassination and other events in our history, connections that were once surprising and, at least within this community, are no longer surprising or shocking, but they still inform us and educate us. We continue to learn every year more about a larger and larger range of political issues, and this is one of the very most important reasons that groups such as A.S.K continue to exist. George Michael has then put together a statement which could serve as a draft of a consensus paper. It's a substantive report. It speaks to issues in the study of the assassination and sets in relief a number of views on what did and did not happen at the Kennedy assassination. It's not entirely clear to me, as I started off saying, this bears some discussion, I think, why a consensus statement should focus on a set of facts, whether they're positive or negative in form. It seems to me there's only two reasons that one might want to put together a consensus based on a set of facts or statements as we've got here. One is to, in a sense, to legislate who can or cannot be a member of a group. You say, this is our credo, and if you like it, you can join. If you don't like it, join someone else. And that, in some cases, plays an important role, and in other cases, it's not necessarily a good thing. The other important role it could play is that it can eliminate the need for discussion at certain points. You say, we all agree that Kennedy was assassinated by a conspiracy. We don't need to argue that any further. So we could make a list of things that we don't need to argue any further. And finally, I suppose it could play a role for the external world. It could say, this is who we are. If you're not very well informed, here's a coherent statement that you might want to chew over. Well, I alluded as well to positive and negative statements, and a negative statement is something like Lee Harvey Oswald was not a lone assassin, and a positive statement might be something like the CIA was using Oswald in an intelligence operation during his lifetime, before the assassination. And both are important, but I would urge that there be fewer negative statements in a consensus statement. Finally, there's the nagging question as to whether a consensus statement will effectively work primarily as an internal document, as George Michael has been explicitly saying about his proposal, or as an external document, one that would be sent to journalists and government officials in one way or another. Now, I think realistically we have to acknowledge that even if we intend for the consensus statement to be an internal document, the fact of the matter is that it'll be used as an external document. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It would be certainly useful to be able to point to modestly informed journalists and government officials, be helpful to be able to point to them a statement that's adopted and accepted by the assassination research community. But if we recognize that, then we have to bear in mind that the statement will be read and seriously considered by non-members, and it should be written with that in mind. So on the basis of those observations, I wrote a two-paragraph beginning that has a slightly different tone, and I just thought I'd read it to you. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963 has served as the basis of a continuing investigation by both private citizens and governmental commissions. The Warren Commission, the House Select Committee, and the intelligence studies of the 1970s have provided the citizenry with much important information essential to unraveling the Kennedy assassination and to finding the identity and motives of those responsible for that criminal act. But the most important, insightful, and fundamentally honest research has been the work carried out by the private assassination research community, most of it done in the face of nearly overwhelming pressure brought to bear by the government and the mainstream privately controlled media. After more than 3 decades, it's clear that President Kennedy was killed as the result of a conspiracy, and that a major cover-up operation was instituted the very moment of that assassination, and that cover-up has not ceased to this very day. Yet despite that cover-up, an enormous body of information has been amassed through the release of government documents and through interviews conducted with figures whose activities touched on the lives of those involved in the assassination in one fashion or another. Documents currently being released to us, coming from the files of the CIA and other government agencies, continue to shed light on the meaning of Lee Harvey Oswald's arrest and eventual death. So that's an example of the kind of ideas that I was speaking to, and I think I'll just draw my comments to a close. Thank you.
Was excellent. It's just what I expected from John. He anticipated. I didn't tell him. In fact, that surprised look and the statement he said, I thought I was going to respond to things you said. I did not want to anticipate. I didn't want to set a direction. But it's as if, it has not infrequently happened, we've been thinking along parallel lines. It is clear from 3 separate communications with about 20 of the leading researchers that certain personal, public, familial, and oddly enough, research considerations now take priority over the consensus statement. It is almost an historical document in itself. And I'm very pleased that John signaled that what is needed is a new statement that is a positive one, because that's precisely what we're going to work on. You may not even see in either at COPA or at A.S.K. Such a thing as a consensus statement, except as a series of positive statements shared by the leading researchers. So, and that's not a positive spin. I mean, independent of anything I was about to say, John Goldsmith came to his own conclusions exactly the same as what we've already decided upon and I had seen coming. Let me preview for you. I may miss something here, but where are the researchers going? The Oswald doubling story is, I put that at the top because it is an extraordinary development, and it's not over, obviously. People we're going to have to honor. There have been others, and I don't mean the second Oswald story, that's separate. The Oswald doubling is an R.B. Cutler's story. If you haven't taken a look at Alias O, the second half of a self-published book, Alias O, anticipates the White Armstrong story. All right, so really, absolutely, it's an intelligent and coherent argument in R.B. Cutler's inimitably incoherent style. If you get past that, you will see that it is one of the major publications in discovering who the Oswalds are. And that story will continue. Concurrently, the other Oswald or Oswald's story is not over with, not the least of which is the John Thomas Mason story. And that's going to be, I will miss things here, but I know from what people have done and the things they've talked to me, before Armstrong left, the last thing he did was give me 4 tapes that I have to return to him on the 2 Oswald's story. I'm not talking about the other Oswald story. So he shared that with me because he knows that I've been working, I had worked on and did a major study in '85, which went past the other Oswald material in my book, and that I was working on the John Thomas Mason story and continue to. So I have become a repository of some important Armstrong material, and obviously, therefore, the 2 stories are now coalescing. The Oswald doubling story and the other Oswalds, including the John Thomas Mason story. Forensic evidence reexamination. I agree with several people, including John, who thought that Kenneth, we raise your hand, that Kenneth ought to have been given regular time, and Kenneth, if it's in our power, you'll get it. I don't mean here, but soon. Because we're looking again taking as fresh a look as possible at bullets and fragments, at the medical evidence, and at weaponry. There's some very important material being done in weaponry. You just missed it, Jack. I was highly critical, but I thought you could take it. All right? No, that's Jack White, and one of the great pioneers. And I said it is with the work that he did and several others that Oswald doubling story will continue to grow. Oswald, with Alfred Korzybski in General Semantics, would said these are slush marks. You do that around a word indicating it doesn't have a whole lot of extensional meaning or concrete reference, or it has too many meanings, or the meanings shift. Oswald and U.S. intelligence, that story is just going to grow and grow and grow. Drugs and arms dealers as active sponsors and brokers, and that gets into the power brokers and the money makers in the power structure out of Washington and elsewhere. The anti-communist network, there are a number of people now who are doing remarkable work in that area. The anti-communist network in government, intelligence, in organized crime, in corporate institutions, and here we come on something that is going to touch on the re-examination of the Garrison case. Is the anti-communist network a series of active sponsors? Are they a support structure? Or are they indeed false sponsors deliberately set up so that you can go down the trail with real information? And this is where the assassination truth is, and you're going down real paths with real evidence that takes you further and further away from the center, the assassination itself. And that's precisely what I think happened in the Garrison case. I think once it was open, it became a repository for maybe at least 5 major false sponsor stories, so that Jim was able to take material and follow that material with real leads. And with real leads, notice how I'm going away from the center, and with real leads, move away from the center. It was only when he got the galley proofs of Farewell America, apparently, that he got back to the center. And that's the material that, for example, Blakey was most interested in, and that's the material that constitutes very possibly still, if not the most accurate, the closest to what probably happened at Dealey Plaza, just a few blocks away. Ruby, there will be now an extensive reanalysis of the Ruby connections. That will be going on in the next year. And finally, what I find extraordinarily valuable, it's Lamar's work and Tom's work and my work, chronology, historical reexamination, historical analysis. Historians are now moving in, I think, 30 years, and it becomes a legitimate exercise for the American Historical Association, and you can get tenure with a long paper on the assassination. And so the articles and books are now going to be appearing. There was an entire program at COPA on historical perspective in the Kennedy assassination. It was extremely exciting. Gibson's book, for example, on JFK and Wall Street, which will be coming out shortly out of Sheridan Square Press, is one impressive version of a professional looking at the historical context of the Kennedy assassination. Enough said. Thank you very much. I want to point out one of the eerie coincidences. We were talking about, remember I went through that rather light examination of Aubrey Reich. Mr. Reich, did you smoke cigarettes in 1963? Many of you were here when we went through it. I sure did. Did you smoke cigarettes on November 22nd, 1963? I sure did. Did you run out of cigarettes on November 22nd, 1963? I sure did, right? You also remember that he said, and I didn't recognize the name, he said when he left, Pepper remained with the body. And that's when I stopped, because if I don't know a name, I don't know what I'm talking about. Pardon? It turns out that that's M.T. Jenkins, who died within, I think, 48 hours of my asking the question. It is in the metropolitan section today of the Dallas Morning News. Eerily, again, that was the next person I was going to talk to. Things happen. We have one person who would like to make some comments. All right. Good. Now I'm going to check in with Gary. And he is going to introduce, this is called a special, if I'm not mistaken. And I'll find him for a moment. And if John will decide he wants some a post commentary, the mic's open. And Jack, while I'm out of the room, would you like to say some words? Mic's open. Pardon? Not at the moment. Okay. Yes.
Here we go. Yes. I'd like to ask you to clarify something for me. What you were saying about a new consensus, that it may not be written soon, is that what you're saying?
It's going to take time. The first one, was it 1991? That took an extraordinary effort because there was no such thing. John Goldsmith said it exactly right. There were maybe 3 sentences that people agreed upon, and this has circulated now for 4 years among one mailing was 100 mailings, and another mailing was to everyone coming to the A.S.K. convention one year. I received nearly 200 responses, and then those are sifted through, coalesced, and a statement is made, and then given to researchers so they may amend it, revise it, etc. That new consensus would then be, as John said, a positive consensus, and that'll take time. I would like to see that out maybe for the spring, but it may not be that we'll see that until the October COPA convention or the November A.S.K. convention. Does that help?
Yes, so I have another
Sure, go ahead.
question. John, you said that you felt that it would be a consistency within the community and be able to be used out of the community. Does A.S.K. have a press pack? Do you have something that you give out to people? Because what I'm thinking is, as a member of the press, that I would like a copy of that so that when people say, who is A.S.K.,
First of all, good. Just the very nature of that organization, that would be from the MacArthurs who handled the conference. The second thing, you have to probably stay in direct touch with COPA through John Judge. And are there any COPA members here in touch with? Yeah, you might want to give her some information, right? Number 2. Number 3, I'll give you my card. And I will send you that developing statement, possibly with do not print yet, ready for publication directly to you, all right? Or we'll exchange cards, all right?
Okay.
John, did you want to make a comment
One more
Sure.
thing, if I could.
Sure.
And as, off the record, not as a member of the press, just personally, word gets around of your interest in this subject. And, I will just be sitting down to dinner with someone and they'll say, well, I understand that you follow the assassination. What do you believe? And I'm like, do you have 3 days? Now, if I had...
That's very good.
If I had something that I could pull out of a briefcase, such as maybe a little 3-fold brochure and say... I'd be glad to talk to you about this, but why don't you read this?
Well, John is correct that, an excellent commentary. John is correct that a positive statement is now needed. But I urge you to use, in just that way, the statement that's in the program. Highlight it for them. Use a yellow highlighter. Underlining destroys the text. Highlight it for them in terms of what you think probably is the most significant set of statements that you feel bear further examination, have seemed convincing to you, whatever. But use that. And before you mark it up or highlight it or ask the MacArthurs, maybe get extra copies of the program. I think it's an excellent idea. John, did you want to make any?
No, I'd just like to speak to you after.
If you hang on, I'm going to tell Gary that we can now continue because he probably anticipates that we are even longer-winded than he knows.
doesn't that sound good? Have y'all had a good time? Truthfully? Good. Mary Ferrell, the program says 11 o'clock, that she would come and make her closing remarks. So y'all, as you can see, it's only 5 till 10, and we knew we weren't going to have the kind of attendance on the last morning that we've had during the week. So I just want to say I'm glad you're all here, and give you an opportunity in just a minute. First of all, I'm going to show you something I think you'll find fascinating. I want to give you an opportunity to shoot at me. You know, I'm kind of semi-responsible for some of this, and I want to get your input and your thoughts, and to urge you, if you will, to go ahead and write. I do, when I get a letter from you fellas, I don't ignore it. I'm kind of a lone ranger. I can't sit down and dictate to a secretary. I only learned to type 5 years ago at a computer. I never had to do that. I was in business for years, and I had secretaries and draftsmen and so forth. I no longer have that. So sometimes if you don't get an answer, you just know that I'm inundated with work. But we do take your letters seriously, and we compile them, and in planning this, we listen to you. And I hope you'll go ahead and keep on writing me, even if I don't acknowledge it, because we do listen. And before I let you shoot at me, I think I've got something, or we've got something that you'll be interested in. And I've asked Richard Bartholomew from, I cannot spell it, but he's from Pflugerville, Texas, down near Austin, and he's run on to something that I think you'll find fascinating, and we'll talk a little bit about it. So, Richard Bartholomew from Pflugerville.
Looks like we might even have some time for questions, so I'll be real brief in introducing this. Being a researcher for 5 years, the disadvantage is if you let it be widely known, you are considered nuts by a lot of people. But the advantage is, as Edgar Tatro recently wrote in a letter, is that people contact you when they come upon information that they think you might know a little bit more about than they do. And that's exactly what happened here. In the first week of October, a person I know in the state government down in Austin called me up and said that in a routine way, some new photographs had surfaced, autopsy photographs of Lee Harvey Oswald. And the way they surfaced was that the state treasury is the depository for material that comes from abandoned bank accounts and safe deposit boxes, and it's a routine matter. And in a safe deposit box, there were these two black and white Polaroid photographs of Lee Harvey Oswald taken just post-autopsy. I asked him on the phone to describe them, and he said that they showed the nude cadaver on a table, and so far it sounded like every other autopsy photo I'd seen of Oswald. And he went on to describe that there are some men standing around the table. And I asked him, are these identifiable? And he said, yes. And I said, how identifiable? And he said, very identifiable. And that was the first hint I had that this was something extremely new, because no other autopsy photos that I had seen or heard about showed individuals in the photograph. Of course, with all of the John Armstrong work and John Newman's work, just having unseen and unknown photographs of Oswald at any time in his life is pretty good evidence to have this late in the game, because it's probably not been tampered with. The fact that it surfaced in such a routine way, it's pretty credible that these photographs really have not been seen since they were taken. Also in the safe deposit box, the only other item that I know was in the safe deposit box was a graduation ring from the Southwest Medical School, dated 1963. My source in the state government said that in talking with individuals, the deputy treasurer at the Treasury, he felt that the photographer was the medical student. He felt that he had reason to believe that that medical student is now deceased, and that the safe deposit box was last held by a member of his family. The Treasury has a policy of not revealing the name of the individual that held the box. They have a process started by Ann Richards several years ago of publishing a list of names in the newspapers around the state in the spring, and if you see your name, you call a special number, and they tell you what they found, and you can claim it. That will happen in the spring, and whoever owned this safe deposit box will have their name published. If it goes unclaimed, these photographs will be auctioned off as early as next fall. They've already had an appraiser look at them, and he's coming from the perspective of things like Jack Ruby's gun that was auctioned off recently and other similar items. And he told him that they would probably go at a very high price, and there would be a bidding war for them. But my concern was that the integrity of these photographs remain intact, knowing fully, as we all do, the history of suppressed, altered, and destroyed documents in this case. I've been nervous for over a month now that nobody knew about these, because anything could happen to them if nobody knows about them. So my mission was to get you guys up to speed on the fact that these exist. They are at the State Treasury. Could you bring me my notebook real quick? I'm going to give you the name of a woman at the Treasury. Anyone can call this lady and set up an appointment and go look at the original photographs. And I would recommend doing that. As soon as I get back to Austin, I'm going to do that. I got her name just as I was leaving to come up here, so I didn't get a chance to set up an appointment. Let's see. Well, I don't see my note. Oh, here it is. Her name is Jackie Schroeter. JACKIE-SCHROETER. The number is area code 512-463-0988. Jackie Schroeter, area code 512-463-0988. And I'm going to not only ask to see those photographs, I'm going to ask to see the full contents of the box, which I presume is allowable as well, and examine it. There may very well be other items in there that are significant, that they don't know that are significant. They may not let me see items that have the name of the box holder or things that would lead me to the name of the box holder. I don't know, but I think the full contents of that safe deposit box should be known. There's some other details I know about it. Nations Bank turned over the items to the State Treasury. They did not say which of their branch banks the safe deposit box was in, but my source once again felt from informal conversations he had that it came from the Nations Bank in Highland Park, Dallas. One way to research and discover the name of the individual who took the photographs without the Treasury revealing them would be, when the list is published in the spring, have ready a list of 1963 graduates of the Southwest Medical School and compare last names on the list, because he did feel that it was a family member that had the box. And that'll give us the name of the photographer most likely. And in fact, Go ahead and put up the first transparency, the text thing to Jack White. When my source got copies of these. He made first-generation photocopies of the front and back, and he got permission to scan them at 300 dots per inch. And I got these from him. In order to get the permission to do this, the deputy treasurer, who he got permission from, made him promise not to reveal the existence of these photographs until after the November 8th election. And I didn't like that. He said that he would break that to the extent that he would give me copies of them. He would tell me that they exist and give me copies of them, but that I had to promise not to reveal where they came from. I could continue to distribute them, but not reveal where they came from until after the November 8th elections. Well, I didn't like that. That was the only way I was going to get my hands on them, and my interest was in preserving this primary evidence. So I got my hands on them, and in order to keep my promise, I sent them to Jack White anonymously, and I chose Jack White because I don't know anyone who is more expert on photographs of Lee Harvey Oswald. And I also knew there was a practical reason. He and I have the exact same hardware and software in terms of computers, and so I knew that he would get the floppy disks in the mail and be able to just look at them immediately. And I inserted this text document in with it that explained it without revealing where they came from. Jack, as I fully expected, he preserved them and brought the copies up here so that I could show them to you. I didn't want to risk bringing my copies on the trip. Yesterday, we told Gary Shaw about this. After Jack White was able to get us his copies of it, we were able to print out copies and start showing them to people. And Dr. Crenshaw happened to be here. Gary immediately showed the photographs to Dr. Crenshaw, and he immediately identified two of the individuals in the photograph and tentatively identified others. Go ahead and put his, he wrote out a handwritten note and signed it and dated it and put the time and military time on there. Yes, well, when you see the photos showing these 6 individuals, this reads from left to right on the photograph. The far left individual is Ben Dowdy. And what does that say after that?
Pathology instructor.
Pathology instructor. Number 2, he didn't know, but probably a law enforcement individual. There were, and those first 2 are in plain clothes. The first, well, you'll see. The third individual he definitely knew, Eugene Frankel, chief of hematology, and he is still at Parkland Hospital. Those Dowdy and Frankel are going to be contacted, I hope this week, and shown the photograph, and they will very well be able to identify everyone in the photograph, I hope. And it dawned on me just standing up here that they will know who the photographer was, most likely. It's my sense from looking at the photographs that these individuals may not have been aware that they were in the camera frame. They may have given this student permission to photograph the body and then weren't paying attention to where he was pointing the camera. And this may very well be the only photograph showing individuals associated with the autopsy or who were allowed access to that room. The fourth one is a resident. I guess he's sure about that. Fifth, he doesn't know, but this individual is apparently in command of the room, the authority figure in the room, and this is probably Earl Rose who performed the autopsy. He said it looked more, in one of them you can see the bottom half of his face in profile. He thought that looked like Earl Rose, but then when he saw a view of the man's face from behind, he didn't think it looked like Rose. But we can identify who that is. Sixth person he also thinks is a resident. So go ahead and put up the one that best shows the individuals. When I saw this, when I popped in the discs and brought this up on my computer screen, I was excited that for the first time we could identify individuals associated with the autopsy. I put the black tape on there. We had several discussions, and it was unanimous that Lee Harvey Oswald, among this group at least, even in death, should get more respect than he has gotten from the world in the last 31 years. So we allotted him that respect. We do have photocopies of these unredacted at the back table, and if you'll reimburse any amount of money and take one of each, all that money will go to Penn Jones.
Where are the...
We have them on the round table in the back of the room, so you can pick those up as you leave. And yeah, we have 100 of each photo, and of course that's Dowdy far left. That's Frankel in the middle there with the pipe and the lab coat. The individual without the tie but with a jacket is what Dr. Crenshaw believes is the law enforcement officer. The man with the watch up his arm near his elbow there is the man he believes is Earl Rose, but maybe not. The watch is readable. With a 300 dots per inch scan on the computer, you can zoom in incredible detail on this, even at 300 DPI. And we can read the time on the watch in both photos, and it's identical. So obviously these photos were taken one right after the other, and the time reads 3:30. Because of the freshness of the cadaver and the fresh appearance of the sutures in comparison to other autopsy photos that I've seen, and also further degradation of some of the dissected areas in other photos, I believe that this is 3:30 p.m. I don't know the chronology of the body after the autopsy. I know that he was shot around 11:20 and immediately taken to Parkland. He died in the operation, I believe. I believe Crenshaw's version of that rather than Lavelle's ambulance death scenario. But I feel like this is 3:30 in the afternoon. So the time could be significant. There's a lot of things that could be significant here. The analysis literally began yesterday on this. That's how new this is. What you're seeing, any thoughts you have, is the genesis of analysis of this new evidence. Naturally, I think it's important to identify fully every person in that room. If they are still alive, they should be talked to. I don't know what the official documents show as to who was in attendance, but that can be compared. If there's people here who shouldn't be there, that it's surprising that they're there, that can be determined. A lot can be determined from this. I think that details of the body itself will be interesting to compare. Put up the next photo. It's more of a close-up of the body itself. You can see part of the head. I've seen other autopsy photographs where it's not the stitches that sewed up the scalp after the craniotomy are not apparent in any photo that I've seen. That could be, and I don't know what the procedure is for this, but it could be because they cut in the back. I have heard reference to sutures in the back of the head, and then they can pull the skin over and do the craniotomy and then put it all back in place, and it looks like nothing was wrong. And that may indeed be the way they do that. So just because there's no cut in the forehead doesn't mean there was not a craniotomy. That's an issue that has been raised by Paul Grudy, who was the mortician at the time of his exhumation in 1981, and reported by Jim Mars in Crossfire and by Nigel Turner and The Man Who Killed Kennedy, in which there was an interview with Paul Grudy. I don't think that can be determined from this photo. I was hoping that it could. But there are other aspects of the body that can be compared, and through a careful observation and probably computer processes, minute details down to scarring and various aspects of the body could be compared. And once again, this is previously unseen and unknown evidence, and it certainly would have a bearing on the two Oswalds scenario and the identity of this particular man who was shot that day. This is the best view of the watch. It's 3:30, and that's it. There's nothing else known about this.
Come on up.
Did you want to say something before?
You know that bullet wound in his stomach? What's all that big patch of red on there?
That's the location of the bullet wound. Not being a doctor, I interpret that as what I know of autopsies is that they're supposed to dissect wounds, and that looks like a dissected wound.
Because I've seen the photos of the National Archives, and it just shows a nice, neat, round hole.
Really?
That other stuff isn't there, you know.
Are sutures present in those photographs as
Not
well?
in the stomach, no.
But elsewhere, as seen here?
Good question.
Well,
I don't recall.
that's the kind of thing that can be established. A chronology of the autopsy could probably be established, but the great thing about this is we have a time reference. And because of details on the body like that, we can establish what happened and when in the autopsy. This, to me, appears like the end. The autopsy is over with.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. This doesn't, what I'm about to say does not relate to this photo, but you mentioned Paul Grudy, and that reminded me that I should probably say something. I plan to write an article for the Fourth Decade on this. In the course of our work, John Armstrong and I had been in contact with Marina Oswald, and John obtained from her, and we saw for the first time, photographs of the exhumed Oswald. Now, we've been trying to do this ever since 1981 to see photos of the body that were taken at the exhumation. I was the original source of the story by Paul Grudy that the skull of Lee Harvey Oswald was intact and had no craniotomy. I took Grudy at his word. I've never had any reason to doubt that he wasn't telling what he believed, and I think he was telling what he believed. However, after seeing the photographs of the skull of Lee Harvey Oswald, two different views taken at the exhumation, I believe that Grudy was mistaken. That does not mean that he was wrong. I just say that he was mistaken in what he told me. He told me that when he observed the skull at the exhumation, that it was all bare bone, and it was all in one piece. Well, it is all in one piece, but just to give you a brief description, of course, the ears are missing, the tip of the nose is missing, the lips are missing, the eyes are missing, but otherwise it's fairly recognizable as the guy that was shot by Jack Ruby. But what Grudy was mistaken about is that the entire skull is covered with mummified skin and there is still a lot of hair on the top. So I think he made a mistaken judgment that the skull should have been in two pieces because there was enough tissue still there to hold the two pieces together. And though the photographs do not show a craniotomy, they don't show otherwise. And I think that should be clarified for the record because Grudy, in all good faith, said that the skull was in one piece, and it is, but he may be mistaken about it not having had a craniotomy.
I've been waiting for someone to see those photographs and be able to settle that. So Grudy never saw the bare skull. at
The photographs,
autopsy?
part of the face is bare skull, but from the ears on up, which is the area that would be affected by the craniotomy, you can't tell because there is dried and mummified skin and patches of hair all over it, and so it's something you can't really tell.
Yeah, but the claim certainly can't be made that Grudy made that there was no.
In my judgment, Grudy was mistaken. The skull to me is clearly recognizable as the guy that was shot by Jack Ruby, and so there is no controversy anymore in my mind that there was some sort of body switch.
Except for the lack of a broken tooth, but that would deal with earlier discrepancy in the chronology.
That's a whole other question. According to what John and I have studied, the guy with the broken tooth was not the guy who was killed by Jack Ruby. In other words, the guy in the grave, I think, is
who they put there.
Marina's husband, and it appears to be the same person to me. So I think that's no longer a controversy, and I think Grudy is wrong, and I intend to write an article about this for the fourth decade.
Following what Jack talked about, I think we shared, was that meal about 2 hours long that we had in the grill. We shared our again, parallel lines of examination of photographs. And what is really exciting is to find out that when I begin to say something, he finishes my sentence. And when Jack begins a sentence, I finish it in certain areas, specifically about Oswald photographs. We've both been on the same track, and we've been using a similar, if not identical, invariants to establish photo manipulation. I shared this with John Armstrong, which is why he passed the tapes on to me before he left. That is one of the tests I have of the photographs of the Oswalds is of any grinning or smiling or open-mouthed Oswald. I don't know the names of the teeth, but these are incisors, I believe. You know, they're the vampire teeth. Just behind them are the teeth that I began to have trouble with when I was very young, so they were filled very early. One of the problems that one of the Oswald has is that his genetic inheritance is that his dental inheritance and his skull inheritance conflict. Hence, there is not enough space for his teeth. Jack can speak to this, but the invariant that I used was that the teeth just behind the incisors project down. If you look at, for example, a rather famous Marine photo of Ann Oswald, he is grinning or smiling, and those two teeth are projected down. Now, in Cleveland, we call it either undershot or overshot, but it meant that the bottom of the jaw was forward, so that these teeth were slightly in this position. That again is a characteristic of the, unfortunately, grinning or smiling Oswald. And one of the Marines has such a dental problem. When John Armstrong gave us that rather ghoulish photo of the teeth, wherever that was taken and whoever that is a photograph of, those teeth are projected down. Hence the photo, reportedly or allegedly, of the exhumed Lee Harvey Oswald is the Oswald with the teeth projecting down. Do you got it? So if you go, you say, whoever that is, they exhumed a body whose teeth seem to indicate that he is the down-projecting post-incisor teeth Oswald. Got it? And then you can continue your work that way. And those photographs will then line up and will finally allow you to point to that exhumation dental work. My problem is that exhumed dental Oswald, that man. That is the man who was exhumed, the man who was shot. I leave that as a question.
Oh, no. I was just going to comment that the photograph that was in John's presentation of the dental work was taken at the exhumation. Marina gave us a complete set of slides of all the that were taken at the exhumation, as well as contact prints of all the black and white, and that's what I was referring to.
Let me add one last descriptive detail that I wasn't able to show. The originals are about the size of our badges. On the back, written around the border, the white border of the Polaroids, all the way around, as if it was a written border itself in handwriting, it just says Lee Harvey Oswald, the man who shot John F. Kennedy, November 24th, 1963, shot by Jack Rubenstein. And the only difference between the two is one of them adds also known as Jack Ruby. But that handwriting is also another identifying factor for the identifying the photographer.
I think you ought to give him a hand. He didn't have to share this with you. And that's really what this is all about, and I appreciate it. And as he has told you, there are copies available. I would urge you to take only one of each, but I would also urge you to be liberal with your donation for those two photographs. If you went and had them made of anybody, it'd cost you, a buck or two, and it don't hurt you. These are historic. You've got something here that's just now seen the light of day, and he's not wanting the money. It's going to Penn Jones. Whatever y'all stick back there for that, we'll go down and help Penn Jones in his time of need. So be liberal with it. So thank you. Richard and Mike Blackwell over there did a lot of running around and helping him, and I appreciate it. I would also tell you this, some of you may or may not know it, there's so much information that we sometimes forget to share all of it, and you may be knowledgeable about it, but some of you may not. There are 12 slides existing of the procedures in the operating room to save the life of Lee Harvey Oswald. And these were taken prior, of course, to the autopsy, and they've never seen the light of day. A fellow by the name of Carl Dockery, and there's documentation in the archives on this, but the photographs have never been seen. Now, those could be important because we know that now that the FBI, on direct orders from Hoover, sent men to Parkland Hospital who got in, donned scrub suits, and were in the room and awaiting a deathbed confession, an ordered deathbed confession. And there's some people that could be identified and perhaps talked to. So there's still evidence. The thing about this is 31 years later, and things are still popping up. We don't know what's in safety deposit boxes around this country, and we don't know what's hidden in the National Archives. So it's exciting to me to see something like this and know that, the pursuit, though we've got some cold trails, there's stuff still out there. So it kind of gives me a little incentive. I hope it does you to keep on keeping on. All right, y'all shoot at me a little bit. Yes, you'll be down exactly at 11. And we're going to have a break here in about 15 minutes. Okay. Anybody want to say anything about the symposium? Your direct comments would be appreciated, as long as you don't hit me.
It may get lost, so before Gary leaves or brings Mary in, just after the end of the last A.S.K. convention, the MacArthur's and A.S.K. said, would I take a more active part in helping them to organize the conference? The other two major organizers were one Mary Ferrell and Gary Shaw. And so before we get to hear the rest of the commentary, and before Gary brings in Mary Ferrell, and I'm certain we will also acclaim her, I'd like you to thank Gary.
I want to thank you again, too, Mr. Shaw, and thank everyone who's been involved in this symposium. It's certainly been very enlightening to me. I'm simply an amateur. I just read about this. I don't do anything else. But I wanted to say that I found the handouts, when they were presented by presenters, very helpful following the discussions. And I would make a recommendation that you ask presenters, if they can, if they possibly can, to give some sort of handout, even if it's a single page with names on it. I think everyone in the audience would find that helpful. Thank you again.
That's a good suggestion. Good suggestion. Anybody else? Sure. Come up to the mic.
One of those days. I have a question about, possibly for you. Has anyone worked towards getting DNA evidence on Oswald? I mean, you have his daughter, you have his still living. Is any other of his family still living? And any tissue samples available, or hair samples, blood samples, even to check the body that's buried as far as DNA?
Okay, yeah, Jack White can speak to that because he's worked, but I can tell you frankly that there is efforts in that direction.
Well, we have considered that because Paul Grudy, I guess secretly or covertly, retained a lock of Oswald's hair. So there is material available, and I believe it has some hair follicles, which I understand are required for that. And Jim Mars and John Armstrong have both considered doing it. I don't know that any progress has been made. To take my shot at you, Gary, you invited us to shoot at you. This is the fourth one of these I've come to. There have been four, haven't there?
Yes.
It gets a little repetitive, and I think that's fine for the new people. But I think greater emphasis needs to be given, if you can do it, to emphasizing new material, new research, things that people have, that even the leading researchers are unfamiliar with.
That's good.
That's my main comment.
And we are trying to do this. One of the problems with doing something like this, so you'll know kind of how we don't have a mindset, but we do try to think these things through. I don't think it does a whole lot for us to come and preach to the converted. Do you understand what I mean? What we're trying to do, and I hope that when you leave here that you'll go out and share as much of this as you can with the people around you to get them to come next year. And why do we want to do that? If we're going to make this an organization that all we do is come in here and share this information among ourselves and not grow and reach out to people all over this country and all over the world, in fact, then I think we're wasting our time. So what we're trying to do is reach some balance. When new people come here, who do they want to see and who do they want to hear? The names. Let's face it, they want to see the people who have written the books and made the documentaries or done whatever. And so we're trying to reach a situation where we can bring in new faces and new names, but still have the old ones. And I know a lot of it is repetitive, but if we're doing what we're supposed to do, there's going to be new people out here in this audience that have never heard what David Lifton says, for instance, or Robert Groden, or some of these people, and those just come to my mind. So y'all work with us. If you have suggestions for NewPro, I want to work them in as best we can, and still reach out and have the kind of name identification that we can get new people to come, just to meet those and to hear those for the first time. So I hope you'll do that. So that kind of get, and I've already told you, let me hear from you. If you've got some ideas for presenters, we're open to them, and want to hear from you. Okay? Anybody else?
Can you take it one more time?
Sure. It'll cost you, but go ahead.
See, I have my right thumb goes on top, and that means that I am a creative person and not a logical person. You have to put up with me, okay? Now, everybody do this, so you see which thumb is on top.
Which thumb goes where?
Mary's left thumb is on top.
Left
Just
thumb
to
is-
let you know, her left thumb is on top, and she is a logical person. Are you a logical person? Logical and creative. Has to do with right brain, left brain, but since I'm the creative and not the logical, I couldn't explain that to you. Just observing as a guest at the symposium, first of all, let me thank you for having me here. And I wish there were more people from the press who had the time to spend 4 days here with you, because it's extremely enlightening. And as someone who, in my personal life, keeps up with the case, I learned more than I ever thought I would. I have to say I have not attended before, professionally or on a personal level, simply because I thought it would be the same old, same old. And luckily I came and found that that was not true. There's two things I'd like to say to you as the audience, whether you're researchers, authors, educators, or if this is just a hobby, is that you need to choose someone to mentor in this. You need to choose one other person in your life to share your feelings with, and make that your goal for next year, that you will bring one person with you.
Good suggestion.
If you have a year from today to go out there and say, I'm going to find one person that I'm going to mentor, and I'm going to share with them how I feel, why I feel this way, and whether they agree with me or go off on their own trail of the assassins, they will be here with me next year. And if that means I have to have a garage sale for them to pay their way, I will do that. So why don't we all agree now that we are going to mentor one person or more and bring them with us next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Dee. Okay, I have about 20 till 11. Mary Ferrell will be making the closing remarks at 11 o'clock, so why don't we take a 20-minute break, and I'll see you back in here at 11. Thank you.
I hate to bother you.
No, go ahead.
I've got a guy at work. I've been trying to, I hate to use the word convert.
Yeah.
He believes you're positive. 100%.
Yeah.
Look, you idiot, this is it right here. You know, not an idiot, but, you know what I mean? If I had a document to bring back home, say, look, I was here, this is what's new.
Good evening, everybody. I was asked to introduce a guy who I sort of ran into before. Need a little feedback here. Larry Harris is probably the world's leading expert on the Tippit killing, and one of my oldest friends. Actually, he's not that old, but we've been friends for a very long time. I know of nobody in this case more dedicated or more helpful than Larry. And you're all in for a treat, because if you're interested in the Tippit killing, you're going to learn everything that there is to know from a man who has spent a lot of years on the subject. It is my pleasure to introduce my friend, Larry Harris.
Thank you, Robert. Well, we're coming down the stretch on the symposium this year, and I've had a blast. I think this has been a great symposium. It's been smaller, more relaxed, more personal, more friendly, and I hope you've been enjoying it as much as I have. And I'd like to thank some of the egomaniacs and anal personalities that have disrupted our previous conferences for not being here this year. I've genuinely enjoyed not having you this year. But last night I was socializing with some of you fine people, just minding my own business, And I was approached by a researcher who asked me if he could talk to me for just a minute about his theory on this. And, just a minute, yeah, right. And for the next 20 minutes, he proceeded to enthrall me with his theory, which was, and he imparted this to me in the most serious and solemn tone, and he has come to the conclusion that the body buried over in Arlington National Cemetery is not that of John F. Kennedy, but rather that of J.D. Tippit. People, can we please get real? At any rate, I think most of you, I'm just going to, we don't have much time and we're running a little behind schedule as it is, so I'm going to just kind of fly through and just hit some highlights because I want to leave a little time for question and answers. I think most of you are familiar with the basic outline of the Tippit murder, that is that Oswald left the school book depository, made his way over to his room, got his gun, took off walking, destination, intent, unknown, just kind of wandering the residential streets of Oak Cliff. J.D. Tippit, a patrolman on patrol alone. Here's the very vague and general description of the Dealey Plaza suspect come over the police radio. Tippit makes his way over into the central business district of Oak Cliff, spots Oswald walking down this street 4 miles from Dealey Plaza from behind and deduces, by God, I think that's him. And he pulls the man over, they chat a minute, Tippit gets out of his car to apprehend the fleeing assassin and is shot dead in the street. And Oswald flees, runs to the theater, goes in without paying for a ticket. We have, 100, 200 police officers descend on the theater. Oswald tries to kill another policeman inside the theater. They kick him around a little bit and handcuff him and take him down to the police station. And then later that afternoon, they link the Tippit murder and Oswald to the book depository, and case closed. But and on the deal, on the surface, it looked like an open and shut case. And at the time, the Tippit murder went a long way toward convincing the public that Oswald had killed this policeman, so therefore he must have killed President Kennedy as well. But the truth of the matter is we don't really know what happened over there at 10th and Patton in the Oak Cliff section where Officer Tippit was shot. Years later, we had private researchers identify other witnesses who had not been interviewed by the investigating authorities in '64. There was a woman named Aquila Clemens who said that she had seen 2 men standing at Tippit's car and that they ran off in opposite directions. There was another gentleman named Frank Wright who said he saw a man run, jump into a gray car, and drive off at a high rate of speed west on 10th Street. And then back in the 1970s, the House Select Committee turned up still another witness named Jack Tatum who had been driving by the scene, and he described the assailant shooting Tippit across the hood of the police car and then walking around behind the police car and walking right up to Tippit, taking careful aim and firing one more shot into Tippit. And, nobody else saw these things. Aquila Clemens didn't see what Wright saw. Wright didn't see what Tatum saw. And it's just puzzling that we can't get eyewitness accounts to match up. But I want to talk about just some of the basic problems that have come up in the years over the Tippit murder. And first and foremost are the time and distance factors. Now, according to the Warren report, Oswald left his room at 1:04 p.m. there on Beckley Street, and Tippit was shot at 1:15 or 1:16 p.m. So that gave Oswald a window of about 12 minutes to walk 1 mile from his rooming house to where Tippit was shot, from 1:04 to 1:16. But the landlady at Oswald's rooming house testified that after Oswald left, she looked out the window a few minutes later And Oswald was standing there at the curb in front of the house. And then at the other end of it, it's quite clear that the Warren Commission misstated the time of the Tippit murder. He wasn't shot at 1:15 or 1:16 p.m. That's the time the police were notified of the shooting over the radio in Tippit's car by a bystander. And it's clear that several minutes elapsed between the time Tippit was shot and the time that the police were notified. Domingo Benavides, who was the closest known witness, said that shooting broke out. He ducked down in the cab of his truck, and he stayed crouched down for a few minutes because he was afraid this man was going to come back and start doing some more shooting. And so that 12-minute window of opportunity that Oswald had to walk the 1 mile, that is narrowed significantly. Let's say 104, and let's just say the landlady said several minutes, but let's say 2 minutes. That'd make it 1:06 p.m. And then over here at 1:16, let's say Benavides says a few minutes elapsed, and then let's say it wasn't 1:16. Let's say it was 1:14. That really narrows significantly the window of opportunity that Oswald had to get to the scene of the crime. And then on top of that, they used a witness named Helen Markham to say that she saw Oswald walking east on 10th Street, and she was the only known witness to say that. You go back to the National Archives and the 26 volumes and start reading all of the reports, FBI, Dallas Police, Secret Service, and almost without exception, they state that the man who shot Tippit was walking west on 10th Street, that is, toward Tippit, and opposite of what Helen Markham said. And this would have Oswald approaching the scene, coming back toward his rooming house from a point beyond the scene of the crime that he could not possibly have reached in the known time frame. So it was seen that the time and distance factors, really effectively preclude Oswald as the killer of Officer Tippit. And then the sheer lack of credible physical evidence in the Tippit murder, and it's a mess, would seem to bear out the thesis that Oswald was nowhere near 10th and Patton when this policeman was shot down. And we have two witnesses at the Texas Theater, Davis and Burroughs, who state that they observed Oswald inside the theater moving around much earlier than the Warren report said. The Warren report didn't put him there until about 1:40 p.m., but Burroughs and Davis have him there even prior to 1:15 p.m., not long after 1 o'clock, and that's pretty significant. And getting back to Helen Markham, now, this woman was something else, but they asked her what time she thought Tippit was shot, and she said about 1:06 or 1:07 p.m. And as it turns out, that's pretty accurate. And the reason she said this was every day she was a waitress at the Eat Well Cafe in downtown Dallas, and every day she would walk from her apartment up to Jefferson Boulevard and catch a bus to downtown Dallas that picked her up at 1:12 p.m. And so at the time she was waiting across the street there, 10th Street, when the shooting broke out, she was en route to and 1 block from her bus stop where she was going to board that 1:12 p.m. Bus, as was her daily routine. So the FBI did a little enactment and study of this, and they concluded that she'd left her apartment at 1 p.m. and she'd gone to the washateria there to use the pay telephone. And there was a clock there in the washateria, and she was conscious of the time, and she looked at the clock, and it was 1:04 p.m. So the FBI took a stopwatch, and they walked the distance from the washateria to where she observed the shooting, and it took 2 minutes and 30 seconds. So if she left at 1:04 and you had 2 minutes and 30 seconds, that would come out right at 1:06 or 1:07 p.m. And yet Oswald didn't leave his room till 1:04 p.m. and then stood at the curb for a few minutes. So see, it just doesn't add up. And then another clue to the possible time of the Tippit murder, and I think it happened probably at about 1:09 p.m. as best as I can determine. At 1:08 p.m., Tippit tried to call the dispatcher and got no response. There was a lot of traffic on the radio, back and forth, and the dispatcher didn't hear him or didn't acknowledge him, and that's the last we hear of J.D. Tippit. Now, at 1 p.m., the dispatcher had tried to call Tippett and got no response. Well, at 1 p.m., Oswald was inside his room. And according to the landlady, while Oswald was in his room, and he was just in there 3 or 4 minutes, a Dallas police car pulled up with 2 occupants in it, beeped the horn, paused for a moment, and then drove off. And that little mystery was never explained. You know, we don't know who was in that car. The Warren Commission let the Dallas police kind of conduct their own investigation. They said, well, we don't know who it was, what it was. So we don't know if it was Tippett. We don't know, you know, if we had some renegade officers out doing something. We don't know the significance of it, but it's a real puzzling mystery that endures to this day. One of those unexplained aspects that we're left to wonder about. Moreover, there was a passerby named Tom Boley who came up on the scene in his car, and he is the only known witness who deliberately checked his watch to note the time, and it was 1:10 p.m. according to the affidavit that he gave that day. So it's pretty clear, you know, that this shooting happened several minutes earlier than the Warren Commission said, and that Oswald almost certainly could not have been there in time to do the shooting. And this was a real problem for the Warren Commission, getting Oswald from his rooming house to the scene in time to do this. You know, when David Bellin of the Warren Commission reenacted it with the stopwatch, and Bellin's the guy that wrote the chapter on the Tippett murder, and it's just about the sorriest chapter in the Warren report. When Bellin re-walked this crazy route that they have Oswald walking, and it was sheer conjecture. To this day, there's not one witness ever come forward who claims to have seen Oswald walking down Beckley and this meandering route up to 10th Street. No one ever saw him. We don't know where he was going, don't know his intent, his destination. It was sheer conjecture on the part of the commission. But they were so pressed for time that the Secret Service, when they were doing the timetable to get, you know, showing Oswald's movements and activities after the assassination, this is actually in the National Archives. There's a Secret Service report that gives Oswald 30 seconds to go into his room, change clothes, get his gun, leave, and stand there at the curb. 30 seconds. This is a government document. I mean, well, these were the guys guarding the president. I don't know. I guess this would be expected. But, and there were several witnesses, you know, that said Oswald was walking west on 10th Street. Jimmy Burt did. Bill Scoggins, the taxi driver, did. In fact, Scoggins, the taxi driver, was sitting there on Patton immediately in front of 10th Street eating his lunch in his taxi cab. And he vividly described Tippett cruising by slowly in his patrol car. But he didn't say anything about Oswald walking east on 10th Street like Markham and the Warren Commission have, and Oswald would have passed within feet of his bumper had Oswald been there and been walking as the Warren Commission said he was. There's a lot of discrepancies about the physical description of the man who shot Tippett. The things going out over the police radio certainly seem to be describing a man other than Oswald. We're told Helen Markham, the star witness, identified Oswald. It was probably the most bizarre identification in the history of law enforcement, but they said she did it. That day, that afternoon, and yet that same day, the FBI interviewed her, and she told the FBI that the man who shot Tippett was 18, red complexion, black hair. Now, does that sound like the Oswald y'all have come to know and love all these years? And in fact, black hair and black wavy hair is a recurring theme in this description of the suspect over there in Oak Cliff running around. They took Oswald down to some police lineups, and about the first 2 lineups, they stuck him in there with some two detectives and a jail clerk who were neatly attired in their civilian attire, and Oswald standing there all beat up and bruised and tore up, you know, from his scuffle with the police. And then the third lineup on Saturday, or I'm sorry, the last lineup on Saturday, they stick Oswald in there with 2 teenagers and a Hispanic man. So Helen Markham was a star witness, and the Warren report termed her testimony reliable, and that's what they said publicly. But behind the scenes, it was a different story altogether. I found a staff summary up in the National Archives that was not published in the 26 volumes, and it warned that this witness is very unsure of herself on most points. Joe Ball, one of the lawyers, said that her testimony was full of mistakes and utterly unreliable. Lieber, another attorney, said that her testimony was contradictory and worthless. In fact, Joe Ball, the following year, in a public debate up in New York City, called Helen Markham an utter screwball. And then the classic comment on all this was they were complaining about the quality of this eyewitness. And Norm Redlich, one of the attorneys, told Lieber, the commission wants to believe Mrs. Markham, and that's all there is to it. That's a verbatim quote. The commission wants to believe Mrs. Markham, and that's all there is to it. That's the kind of sham investigation Warren Commission conducted. Bill Scoggins was another key witness, the taxi driver sitting there eating his lunch, and they tell us he identified Oswald out of a lineup where Oswald was just mad as hell and saying the police were railroading him and he wanted an attorney, and he was just ranting and raving, just furious, saying these lineups are wrong, you shouldn't be putting me in here with these people, and I don't look like them, they're not dressed like me, and I'm being railroaded, and I want my lawyer, and, you know, Scoggins, he didn't have to be real bright to figure out who the guy is. So then the FBI interviewed Scoggins 2 days after this lineup, and they showed him a photograph of Oswald, and according to the FBI report, Scoggins could not be certain the person he observed in Oak Cliff on November 22nd was actually identical with Oswald. And in fact, when Scoggins appeared before the Warren Commission, he admitted somewhat sheepishly that he had selected the wrong photo. He had selected the photo of a man other than Oswald as Tippett's killer. The ballistics evidence. 4 bullets taken out of Tippett's body, 4 shells recovered at the scene, open shut case. Wrong. There was, as the commission attorney said, a slight problem. That's another verbatim quote. They didn't match up. The bullets didn't match up with the shells as far as the manufacture. The bullets in Tippett's body, there were 3 made by Western Company and 1 by Remington. But the shells purportedly recovered at the scene, there were 2 Western and 2 Remington. They didn't match up, and the Warren Commission was unable to offer a plausible explanation for that. The bullets removed from Tippett's body were never traced to Oswald's revolver. You can look it up. FBI couldn't trace them to that revolver. Many years later, the House Select Committee, using all the advances in technology and sophisticated methods for testing of these kinds of things, were unable to match those bullets to Oswald's revolver. In fact, the only tangible evidence linking Oswald's revolver to the Tippett murder are the 4 shell casings. And there's no question that those shells came from Oswald's revolver. But when they were fired in that revolver is another question altogether. And in fact, the second description of the Tippett gunman to go out over the police radio stated that the gunman was apparently armed with a .32 caliber dark finish automatic pistol. Well, that's just great because Oswald was carrying a revolver. A revolver and an automatic pistol are 2 types of handguns altogether, and they fire different kinds of ammunition. You can't put automatic ammunition in a revolver and fire it. And then a few minutes after that reference to a .32 caliber dark finish automatic, Jerry Hill of the police went over the radio and notified the dispatcher, the shell at the scene indicates the suspect is armed with a .38 caliber automatic rather than a pistol. And he meant to say revolver, but he's differentiating between an automatic and a revolver. With a revolver, you have to manually eject the shells. With an automatic handgun, as you fire, the shells eject automatically. And there's two references to an automatic handgun that went out over the police radio that day. Oswald didn't have an automatic handgun at the time of his arrest. And then there was an officer named J.M. Poe who received 2 of the 4 shell casings at the scene. And he scratched his initials on them as part of the chain of evidence. And the shells, incidentally, were retained by the Dallas police for more than a week. A lot of the evidence was turned over that night to the FBI, but the shell casings were retained by the Dallas police for a week before they turned them over. So 7 months after all this, the FBI went to Poe and said, we need you to identify these shell casings. And they had all 4 of them. They wanted him to pick out the 2 that he had scratched his initials on. So the FBI report says Poe stated he recalled marking these cases, but he stated after a thorough examination of the 4 cartridges shown to him on June 12, 1964, he cannot locate his marks. Therefore, he cannot positively identify any of these cartridges as being the same ones he received on November 22nd. Now, that's reassuring, isn't it? And then the bullets, originally the Dallas police told the FBI that they only had 1 bullet, and that was turned over. It was a bullet that had he was shot 4 times. He was hit once in the head, 3 times in the chest. One of these bullets struck a button, and it didn't really penetrate his chest. And so that bullet was turned over. And the FBI was told by the police that was all the bullets they had. Well, many months later, the Warren Commission sent the FBI down to Dallas and asked them to find out what's going on here. And they found the 3 additional bullets in police files. Now, what was that all about? They found a jacket over not far from the Tippit murder, just a couple blocks over at a service station. They had a little parking lot on the side, and police recovered a white jacket thrown up under one of the cars. And they said Oswald threw it down trying to change his appearance. And all the contemporaneous reports to that jacket are white. But the jacket that was ultimately turned over to the Warren Commission and is up in the National Archives is a gray jacket. And I've held this jacket in my hands and examined it, and it's a gray jacket. You might call it a light gray jacket, but you damn sure wouldn't call it a white jacket. And a policeman investigating the murder of a brother officer is not going to make a mistake like that and call a white jacket a gray jacket. And for many years, we didn't know who this officer was that had found the jacket. The Warren report credited another officer who had testified explicitly that he didn't find the jacket, he didn't even see the jacket. And yet the Warren report comes out and they name him as the guy that found it. Well, years later, I was able to identify the officer who did find the jacket, and I called him up on the telephone and asked him about this. And he was kind of evasive, and when I asked him what color was the jacket, he got mad and he said, who are you and what are you doing this for? He said, I'm going to tell you something. He said, that information might be something they don't want given out. And he hung up on me. And what was that all about? The jacket that was found had a laundry tag in it. And the Dallas police didn't have any means to trace the laundry tag, so they gave it to the FBI, and the FBI tried to trace the laundry tag. And they canvassed all the dry cleaning establishments in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, as well as the New Orleans area where Oswald had lived the summer of '63. And they were never able to trace the laundry tag on this jacket, even though the tag was an indication that it had been recently dry cleaned. There should have been some kind of record. And I've got all the this wasn't in the Warren report. They never mentioned that there was a laundry tag on this jacket, and they weren't able to trace it. They never mentioned it. 900 pages in the Warren report. That's not in there. And I've got all the unpublished documents on this FBI investigation, and it was really a sham. They came real close to identify. They almost narrowed it down to 7 dry cleaners that used the particular type of marking mechanism. There were only just a handful of laundries here in Dallas that used that particular kind that was on this laundry tag, and they could have come. They came real close to tracing the laundry tag, but they didn't. So that's just some of the highlights, some of the problems in the Tippit murder. Now, Jefferson Davis Tippit. Where the hell did that come from? For years I have been reading in books, Jefferson Davis Tippit, Jefferson Davis Tippit. That wasn't his name. Where did that come from? That's not his name. What did JD stand for? It didn't stand for anything. His father gave him the initials JD in lieu of a name. His father, Tippit's sister told me that his father had been reading a little old dime novel, and it was some kind of action-packed thriller, and the father was so fond of the main character in this little novel that he named his son, his oldest son, J.D. So where this Jefferson Davis Tippit come from, I just don't know, but I keep reading it. Even books coming out this year, I'm still reading Jefferson Davis Tippit. But Sylvia Marr, who wrote the Bible for assassination researchers, Accessories After the Fact, it is the definitive dissection of the Warren Report, and she dissed them. If y'all know how the young people talk, she dissed them. But this is a quote from her book. When we turn to J.D. Tippit, we find no biographical excesses such as they had with Ruby and Oswald, but extreme reticence. Tippit, the policeman, and the man is one-dimensional and is a one-dimensional and insubstantial figure, unknown and unknowable. The Warren Commission was not interested in Tippit's life and apparently interested in his death only to the extent that it could be ascribed to Oswald, despite massive defects in the evidence against him. The Warren Commission's profound lack of interest in Tippit may be measured by its failure to take testimony from his widow, who probably saw him less than 2 hours before his death. And in fact, the unpublished documents up in the National Archives show that the idea to do a background investigation of Tippit came up just almost literally as an afterthought. On May 8th of '64, one of the staff attorneys wrote a memo to the chief counsel. As far as I can tell, none of the areas is responsible for handling any of the background or connections of Officer Tippit. Since he has been linked to both Oswald and Ruby by various rumors, and since he was a principal figure in the events of November 22nd, I was wondering if any investigation of him has been undertaken. So that was May 8th, and then on May 12th, Rankin, the chief counsel, wrote a letter to J. Edgar Hoover asking him to conduct a limited background investigation of Officer Tippit. And Rankin closed his letter by saying, "As I am sure you are aware, this request is designed to obtain certain basic information which can be relied upon to refute unfounded allegations which have developed in the course of this investigation." Now, they hadn't even conducted the damned investigation. How did they know these rumors were unfounded? And then Chief Curry was going to come in and testify, and he was going to bring Tippit's DPD personnel file. So one of the attorneys wrote a memo to Rankin on April 20th saying, Chief Curry will bring with him the personnel file of Officer Tippit. It might be advisable to establish Tippit's good reputation in the department during the examination of Chief Curry. You know, not establish was Tippit a good cop or a bad cop or a son of a bitch. We're going to establish his good reputation. The conclusion comes before the questioning and investigation. Now, that's the kind of sham investigation they did on the Tippit murder. Who was Tippit? We don't know a lot about Tippit. He was born up in Red River County up here in northeast Texas, about 100 miles, 120 miles from Dallas. Was a good old East Texas farm boy. The place where Rick Nelson's plane crashed, you know Ricky Nelson, Ozzie and Harriet, he was killed in a plane crash back in 1985. And the place where this plane crashed and burned was just real near, I mean just within a real close proximity to the area where Tippit was born and grew up. It was not a town, it was just rural farming communities back at that time. But the FBI did a sort of a evaluation. And by the way, I forgot to mention this, when they asked Hoover to do the limited background investigation, that was on May 12th. Well, by May 20th, Hoover had the whole report in hand. That's how quickly they conducted the investigation. But here's some, let me just read you a few excerpts from the FBI background investigation on Tippit. In his personnel file with the police department was a psychiatric evaluation. He joined the department in 1952, had been on the force 11 years without promotion at the time of his death. Now, he had a limited education. He dropped out of school in about the 10th grade. He was not very bright at all. He dropped out of school because he didn't care about school and couldn't get passing grades. He had no hope of advancement in the police department because he couldn't pass the written test. And he was not particularly ambitious. He had no real desire to advance within the department. He was quite content just being a patrolman and going about his business. A psychiatric report dated November 17, 1952 characterizes Tippit as wholly devoid of imaginative facilities. I don't have to translate that for you, do I? It indicated his interest and achievements were limited and that his mental functioning and thinking corresponded with the community at large. And that's not real reassuring. His grip on reality was below average, and it was noted that errors of judgment could be expected. During Tippit's career as a police officer, he received several minor injuries, which included a dog bite in 1957 and a laceration from a prisoner in January 1956. His most serious injury was during April 56 when he was stabbed in the abdomen and knee by a mentally deranged person. It was later found that part of the ice pick was embedded in his kneecap, which required surgery to remove. Because of this injury, he had considerable difficulty with his knee from then on. While a police officer, Tippit was charged with failure to respond to 3 radio dispatches, all of a minor nature. He was criticized by citizens for discourtesy after issuing a traffic summons. However, investigation of this charge indicated the citizen was disgruntled and probably lied. Tippit also failed to appear at scheduled court appearances on 3 occasions, which resulted in a 1-day suspension without pay on his second dereliction. He got some accommodations and awards for being courteous to a motorist. Was the recipient of a Superior Award based primarily on an incident in 1956 whereby Tippit and his partner received a call for a routine investigation at a bar where a white intoxicated male was present. When asked to leave, this man attempted to shoot Tippit in the head. However, the gun did not fire. Now, that's like deja vu. Now, where have we heard that before? Tippit and his partner drew their service revolvers and killed the individual who was later identified as Leonard Garland, who was wanted by the Federal Bureau of Investigation for an offense he committed in another state. Now, I went pretty deeply into Tippit's background, his police career, his personal life, and there's not a lot mysterious or complex or suspect about Tippit. He was a pretty simple guy, as we've indicated. He wasn't too bright, and he liked playing dominoes and fishing and hunting. He had no interest in politics, didn't read newspapers. We don't know of anything, KKK, John Birch, nothing to indicate that he had any interest whatsoever in these kinds of things. Just a good old boy. He worked a lot of odd jobs on the police department. He had a part-time job at Austin's Barbecue for 2 or 3 years. And worked just about all the odd jobs that he could, and probably the most interesting thing that I found out about Officer Tippit was that he had a weakness for women, and he got around, and he especially liked waitresses. Some of these cops had a thing for strippers, Dean and Olson, some of these guys, they had a thing for strippers, but Tippit had a thing for waitresses, and got to know some of them pretty well. And with his sexual proclivities, he I guess you could say he was kind of a poor man's JFK or a redneck JFK. And I never turned up anything to indicate that Tippit and Oswald, knew each other or were known to each other. I never had the impression that Tippett was the kind of guy that would enter into a conspiracy if he were approached for such a thing, would agree to do that. My read on it is it would be out of character for him, and I was never able to link him with a plot or a conspiracy. You know, there's all kinds of conjecture over the years that Tippett was supposed to kill Oswald or pick Oswald up and take him to Redbird Airport, and then there's been all kinds of stories over the years, and I know that Shari and Beverly possibly maybe would have said they've seen Officer Tippett at one time or another in the club, and I don't know, but my impression is that Tippett was more VFW. You know, Ruby was Carousel Club, and Tippett was just not in that orbit. He'd been more comfortable at a VFW, you know, maybe drinking a beer and shooting the bull with the boys and playing dominoes and that kind of thing, you know. And there was just not a lot about Tippett that was too complex or mysterious. Now, there was one troublesome thing that came up when Chief Curry, the Dallas police, testified before the Warren Commission. Well, Alan Dulles, the former CIA director, was sitting in there, and just out of the blue, he said to Curry, well, a rumor reached me that Officer Tippett had been involved in some kind of narcotics trouble. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And, of course, Curry was unable to tell him anything about that. And, you know, that's kind of mysterious because I feel sure Alan Dulles didn't, you know, pick up his information off the street, you know. There had to be some basis for this, but I must tell you it would be out of character from everything I picked up about Tippett for him to be involved in some kind of narcotics trafficking and so forth. And so that's just some of the information I wanted to share with you about Tippett himself, because there's not a lot in the public record about Tippett. And I see that, boy, we're really running down on the time, and I'm wondering, you know, if you want to throw a few questions at me, I'll be glad to answer any questions you have. And I guess they're taping this, so if you have a question, if you could maybe come down to the microphone so that they can pick it up on the video track. Be my guest.
Larry, do we have any way of knowing whether or not Oswald's gun was fired that day?
Well, it's like with the Manicurcano rifle up on the 6th floor. There's nothing in the public record to suggest that it was swabbed, and that's like just a basic routine investigative procedure, but nowhere in the public record does that appear.
One other real quick question. There was a police report that someone left and went to the library from the scene. How does that pan out?
Well, what it was, after this fellow shot Tippett, he ran, and if you follow the progress of the investigation on the police radio, there are repeated references to him running down the alley. He's running down the alley. We got an eyewitness that says he's going down the alley, and they're chasing him down the alley. And finally, somebody, and this is on the police radio, saw him run into an old church that's over there a block from where Tippett was killed, and they were getting ready to go in. Jerry Hill went on police radio, "Oh, give me some squads over here. We got an eyewitness that said you ran in this church. We're going to go in and shake it down." And they were getting ready to do that, and then all of a sudden a police transmission came over the radio. "Oh my God, he's running into the library down at Jefferson Boulevard." And so all the patrols pack up and go down there, and they run down there, and it turned out it was some guy that worked there running in to tell them that John F. Kennedy had been shot.
Hi, Larry. It's always a pleasure to see you. Ross Ralston from Minnesota.
By the way, Ross wrote a real neat book that we need to get back in print. Came out in the 1970s, called History's Verdict, The Acquittal of Lee Harvey Oswald, and it makes a very compelling case for Oswald's innocence in both the Kennedy and Tippett murders.
Okay, I've got a bunch of stuff to not only ask questions, but just food for thought. I thought it was an interesting quote that Tippett was, quote, wholly devoid of imaginatory facilities. Okay, here's a man who never had a promotion for so many years, and he sees the back of a man's head, according to the Warren Ford Dulles Boggs Russell Cooper McCloy Commission, and he connects him with the description on the police radio. I mean, that's their version. Now, he's looking for a guy 165 to 175 pounds. That's a light heavyweight boxer. Oswald is slender, weighs 136 pounds. He's 10 years off in age. He's looking for a guy in his early 30s. Oswald is 24. And this man, who never had a promotion, wholly devoid of imaginatory
faculties suddenly decides the time has come to act. Well, that's going to be his last act if that's what happened. I'll tell you that. And so I really wonder about why the man was stopped. And that's not even assuming it's Oswald. But let's move on from there. Henry Wade is an interesting character, and you mentioned him on several times during the course of this symposium. And I want to talk about the lineup, because that deals both with JFK as well as, should I call him Jefferson Davis Tippit anymore? I think you've put an end to that. 2 teens and a Hispanic. Okay? Now, people in psychology, I'm working on my dissertation in sociology, but it's kind of close. We deal with criminology. You know, the psychiatry of the witness is well known. The witness isn't expecting to see something right in front of their eyes. It just happens. And the witness wants to be helpful. And they know the police have a suspect, otherwise they wouldn't be at the police station looking at a lineup. And with a little bit of prodding, like 2 teens and a Hispanic, it can be pretty easy to identify the proper party, the right person. And when Oswald was asked those questions, where do you work, what did he say, Larry? Did he give him the truth?
Sure he did.
Texas School Book
The detectives in the jail court gave fictitious answers, by the way.
Yeah, right. I mean, again, over the airwaves, people had heard the Texas School Book Depository. And he's got a black eye, doesn't he? That's pretty darn easy to spot. Now, what did Ted Calloway say during the courtroom thing with Jerry Spence? We want to wrap this case. He said a policeman said to him, what? We're going to wrap this case up real good. We want you to take a good, how did that go? Good, hard look at the man and see the one who looks different? Well, I don't suppose they're looking at the Hispanic, but actually they all look different. The 2 teenagers, teeny boppers, and dang. But Henry Wade has a history. The Wade case dealt with lineups. And you know that it went to the Supreme Court. And he was chastised in 1967, you didn't have this right back then, to stack lineups. He did this in his office as a matter of business. Now, I could talk about the arrest, but I've been told just to ask questions, so I guess that's what I'll do. Scoggins, okay. Jerry Hill, I'm looking at the bullet right now. He said that over the radio, in addition to his, and you know that the automatics leave a mark at the base of the shell. And that's how you know, because it self-ejects. And if you don't have that mark, you don't have an automatic. And Oswald had the ancestor of that, which was what? The revolver, where you tap the bullets out. Let me ask you about finding those shells. I don't want to take up too much time. I understand everything is limited, and I'm not really asking questions as much as trying to probe and get a dialogue here going, because it's all food for thoughts. Poe's initials were missing. Can you admit those into evidence? If the initials are missing?
Had Oswald lived to stand trial? No.
Okay, the laundry tag. Now, can that be admitted into evidence, that jacket? Do you know Bellin changed the exhibit number in his book, as Jerry Polikoff noted?
He did.
From 162 to 163 to make it look like he identified a different jacket?
They brought the wrong jacket up, and Benavides identified the blue jacket as the jacket, as the wrong jacket. And then Bellin later, in his book, switched to make it look like Benavides had identified the correct jacket.
Well, let's finish with this. There is one thing about Tippit, and I don't believe in guilt with association, but you said this guy is kind of, I don't know if he plays tiddlywinks or
dominoes,
but he might eat pizza then. But he is. They did say he was connected to John Birch Society. That he was an extreme right winger. Now, not that it means a lot, but I mean that is something about his background politically. I understand. Okay, I understand. Okay, what is your take on that? Is there any Birch connection?
The Tippit?
Yeah.
Well, he worked for Austin Cook, who owned Austin's Barbecue, and Austin Cook wasn't admitted a member of the John Birch Society. But as I've indicated, Tippit just wasn't interested in those kinds of things that I was ever able to turn up.
Talk to you later.
Larry, one question. Barbara and Virginia Davis, okay, did they see the person doing the shooting, or they just recovered shells?
Well, I need a Valium every time I read the Davis sisters' testimony, because that was truly some bizarre testimony, but there were some confused witnesses. No, they did not see the shooting itself. They heard the shots and looked through their screen door and saw somebody running across their lawn. Mm-hmm. Yes, Jack?
Larry, I wonder if you could elaborate on two things that I've heard over the years. Two incidents immediately in the minutes preceding the assassination. I'm not sure you know about them, but if you do, I'd like for you to elaborate on them. One is the story that Tippit was seen in his patrol car near the end of the bridge leading into Oak Cliff within a half hour before the assassination, as if he was waiting for somebody to come across the bridge. The other is that within about 10 minutes before Tippit was killed, he ran into a record store on Jefferson Boulevard, made a hurried telephone call, and that was the last time that anybody saw him, as far as we know. Now, do you know anything about those two incidents?
Well, yes. There were a total of 5 witnesses saw Tippit sitting in his patrol car parked in the parking lot of a gas station sometime between 12:45 and 1 p.m. And he sat there as if just watching the cars come across the Houston Street Viaduct, which is the route that Oswald came across in the taxi cab. And all of a sudden, Tippit took off at a high rate of speed. Sometime around 1 p.m., there were 2 employees in the Top 10 record shop on Jefferson Boulevard, which is just down the street from the Texas Theater. And they gave stories that Tippit came rushing in and went behind the counter to use the telephone and made a frantic phone call and was very impatient. Apparently did not get an answer, slammed the phone down, rushed out, got in his car, and took off at a high rate of speed. And that's they apparently are the last people that we know of who saw Tippit. And again, this was right sometime around 1 p.m. And we remember that at 1 p.m. the dispatcher called Tippit and got no response. Yes, Connie?
Do you have his Tippit's address in Dallas at the time of his death?
Yes, ma'am.
And would you give it and describe what location it was in?
It was 238 Glencairn Street in far South Oak Cliff. They were new homes that had been built in the early 60s, and quite a number of police officers lived out in that area. It was nicknamed Pistol Hill because so many officers were buying homes in that area. 238 Glencairn.
Thank you.
Two questions. One, wasn't there a jacket or a coat that was hanging from the hanger in the back seat of Tippit's car?
Photographs taken at the scene show a jacket or shirt, I think it's a jacket, on a hanger in the back of the patrol car. That's right. Now, the police had a summer uniform and a winter uniform. They had already switched over to the winter uniforms, which were long sleeve. That day was a particularly warm day here in Texas. It was 68 degrees. And I suppose Tippit maybe had taken his jacket off and had it hanging in the back.
So it was his jacket?
I'm sorry?
It was his jacket?
We don't know. We don't know.
The other question, didn't most witnesses say that the gunman had been walking, west? Walking east?
Walking west on 10th Street, whereas the warrant report said east on 10th Street, and that was on the basis of the one witness, Helen Markham, the utter screwball.
Which direction would have been walking towards Jack Ruby's apartment?
If Oswald had been walking east on 10th Street, as the Warren report said, he would have been headed generally toward Jack Ruby's residence, which was several blocks beyond the Tippit crime scene.
Thanks.
Big Al.
Larry, I've never seen any pictures of the Tippit crime scene with the body. All I've seen is just the car. There's not even an outline of him on the street. Have you? Are there any?
No, they're not. See, when this shooting happened, a lot of people, a number of people started calling the police, and the Dudley M. Hughes Funeral Home also ran an ambulance service, and it was located virtually just 1 block away. So the ambulance was able to get there at 1:18 p.m., get Tippit in there, and rush him to Methodist Hospital. So the ambulance got there before most of the squads began arriving.
Larry, that was my first question, actually, but as usual, he steals my thunder. The second one, one of the Davis sisters, I can't remember which one it is, claims that when she first saw the Tippit car outside the house next door,
she didn't think this at all unusual because she saw that car there so often. She thought he lived there. Have you or anyone else made any inquiries as to who actually lived in that house and whether there was a connection with Tippett?
Yeah, you know, I lived with the crisscross directories back in the 1970s trying to find everybody that lived in that whole general neighborhood. But it was a very transient neighborhood. It was a lower income neighborhood, a lot of apartments, apartment houses, duplexes, and a very transient neighborhood. And so it was very difficult to locate a lot of those. But you're right, Virginia Davis did testify that the police car was parked between the hedge that marks the apartment house where he lives in and the house next door. And Bellin, of course, did not ask, wait a minute, where he who? They didn't ask her, who is he? She seemed to be alluding to Tippett, but it's not clear because Bellin didn't ask her. Scoggins, the taxi driver, said, I noticed Tippett stopped down there, and I wasn't paying too much attention to the man, you know, just used to see him every day. Well, see him where? Where did Scoggins see him every day? You know, Bellin didn't ask the question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One more question, Larry. I think you were the one to discover this lady named Witherspoon. Could you elaborate on that? Because I think most people would be interested in that story.
Well, I'll tell you, we really don't have time. It's a fascinating story, but basically Tippett had worked at Austin's Barbecue, become romantically involved with a waitress who was estranged and later divorced from her husband. It was a very serious relationship. Tippett wanted to marry her. He was willing to divorce his wife and marry her. She declined his marriage proposal for fear it would, just because of his family and his career. Relationship tailed off. She realized in September of '63 that she was pregnant, and it's just a messy situation. She told the House Select Committee that she and her husband, after she and Tippett broke up, she and her husband got back together in the summer of '63. Well, Ken Holmes Jr. and I, and Ken, you're in the audience, raise your hand. Ken did a lot of the work with me on the Tippett murder back in the 1970s, and on this story specifically. He and I interviewed the former husband of the lady, and then he was very adamant in telling us that they didn't get back together until the next day after Tippett was killed. That he went over there and took her to the funeral home, and she just became hysterical and broke down and told him that she was pregnant by Tippett, and so they reconciled. The child was born 7 months later, and they raised it as if it was their own. And, it's just a situation that existed, and had that situation been known to investigators in 1964, it might have placed the Tippett murder in an altogether different light. And I'd be glad to chat with any of you about that afterward. But I have to shut this down, and I want to close with a quote. The other day on Saturday, I ended with a quote from Jim Mars, our brother from Springtown, Texas. This quote is from Henry Hurt, who wrote the book Reasonable Doubt. It doesn't have to do with the Tippett murder, but just the Kennedy assassination in general, and I want to read it because that's what this is all about. That's what we are all about. Talking about the official investigations. Despite these failures, it is encouraging that it was the very resiliency of the American system that prevented the JFK case from being stifled. A band of people, lawyers, homemakers, a goose farmer, businessmen, a mathematician, an architect, scholars, secretaries, doctors, professors, a weekly newspaper editor, photographers, even former government agents, would not swallow the official line. They began, each in his or her own way, their diverse work to get at the truth. Known as the critics, these people have managed through sheer diligence and persistence to keep the case alive and to inch it towards some plausible resolution. They have been denounced from some of the most prestigious podiums in the land, called blood-sucking scavengers, accused of personal greed. It is they who have kept alive the search for truth. Without their work, the evidence uncovered and the legitimate leads developed would likely have been lost many years ago. Without their work, the continuing quest for truth about the JFK assassination would simply be impossible. And that's what we're all about. That's what A.S.K. is all about. That's what COPA is all about. And I would just encourage all of us to try to find ways to come together, to be more unified, to knock off the infighting, and to have more unity and solidarity. because it's time to get to the bottom of this case once and for all. And I just hope you've enjoyed this conference. And I say let's do it again next year because the case is still open. Thank you very much.
All right, again, let me say how glad I am that you're here. For those of you who were not here in the earlier session, Richard Bartholomew made a couple of new discovered photographs available, and I think there's still some back on the back table along with a little money tray. And if you did not hear, the money, so be liberal, the money will go to Penn Jones. Mr. Bartholomew said he's not interested in even recouping his cost on the reproduction of them. So get one of each, only one of each, and leave some money in the tray, and it goes to a worthy and a worthwhile cause. So if you'll do that for me. I'm going to say just a couple of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 things in these closing remarks, because I want you to know how much I appreciate you and appreciate your interacting with me and letting me know how you feel about this conference, this symposium, and I want to hear further from you. You know, my personality is one of, this is so important. I want us to be all united. I want us to be a big, strong wedge that drives into the eye of this government deceit and hypocrisy and suppression. And I hope that we can put aside all the minor differences and all concentrate on what we can all agree on, and that is Lee Harvey Oswald never got a fair trial. We don't know who did it. We want to know, and our government is obligated to release all the files and let us know for once and for all what is really there and where the finger really points in this case. So please do that for me. And let's stand united with COPA, with any other organization of like mind, and let's go forward. I think this next year is going to be some of the, we'll be given some of the more eye-opening revelations in this case than we've seen in 31 years. And when we come back here next year, this was a low year. I don't know what the final count's going to be, but I can guarantee you it's going to double that next year and maybe more. And it may be our biggest year ever. So keep that in mind. I can't stress enough the point of interacting. You've met some new folks. You've reacquainted yourself with some folks. Boy, share things with them. And let's go on with this and never lose sight of our common purpose, which is to finally know the truth. Focus on these new documents. If you're not involved in that, get involved in it. Because there are so many. There is not one person or 20 people or 1,000 people that can go through and know all that's in this new file release. We're not like the media. The media can take a 100,000 page release and announce the next day that there was nothing in it of any importance. And, you know, I've just never been able to do that, and I don't think you have either. So please do that. I can't stress enough misinformation and disinformation. Y'all do know the difference in the two. I have been guilty of misinformation, but I can guarantee you it was done honestly. I thought I was telling you something that was the truth. That's misinformation, and we soon learn and back off of it. Disinformation is those people who will put out lies and try to get us to believe it. And I don't think any of us are guilty of that. But when you find somebody that's guilty of disinformation and you know that they know that it's disinformation, go ahead and write their name on the bulletin board. We don't need them, you know. And so let's stay straight and true, and if we're guilty of misinformation, let's admit it, and let's go on. The most serious thing that we can do is to reach out to others. And I've urged several of you, and a young lady stood up and said this publicly a while ago, bring somebody with you next year. You know, if we're going to be the same old body every time, you know, we're not really doing our job. So reach out and bring some other people that are new and really want to get to the bottom of this, and continue to persevere. This thing ain't over till it's over, as a famous Yankee catcher said one time. So I think we've got a lot of work to do, and I hope you'll do it. And so with that, I took a little privilege here, and y'all pardon me for doing so, but I want you to know I like you, and I want to stand together with you, and there's not anybody in here that I'm going to fight with over whether Lee Harvey Oswald's tooth is in his head or in the casket. You know, I want to fight with you to go after the real truth about this thing. Okay? The lady that's going to make these closing remarks needs no introduction. She's the grand lady of research, and she's an FBI agent. Now, anybody that would say that this lady is an FBI agent, you're going to get on the bad side of me, as the old song goes. So, Mary Ferrell has been doing this forever, and she is my girlfriend. I love her, and she's been a great, great help to me, and I can't say enough about her, and she's agreed. She doesn't do this kind of thing very much. You know, those of you who know her, she likes to stay in the background, but I'm young enough that I can twist her arm now, and she can't hurt me. So we kind of twisted her arm to make these closing remarks, and I hope you'll listen attentively. But welcome to the platform and to this microphone, Miss Mary Ferrell of Dallas, Texas.
Once again, we came together and discussed the issues and exchanged points of view in the furtherance of our cause, which is to discover and reveal the truth about the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. What we have seen and heard during this conference we'll take with us. We'll consider and think about it. We'll discuss it with our friends and co-workers. And I hope you'll find it highly valuable. I emphasize we in its most profound sense because the proposition of remaining united is being more sorely tested today than at any time since we began investigating the tragic event which occurred in the streets of this city 31 years ago today. We would not be meeting here today without the efforts of many dedicated people working together. Some of those people have worked together for many years, but just as important as those older researchers are the younger people who have enthusiastically joined our ranks in the past few years. We must preserve the great reservoir of solidarity which we have striven so hard to create. That solidarity will, I believe, one day break down the walls of deceit and hypocrisy which remain at the heart of official government secrecy. And that day may be closer than we think. Our adversary grows older, and unlike the ranks of our researchers, is not being replenished by those with enough knowledge and dedication to correctly perceive the contents and significance of the documents which are being released today. Many now in official positions are not of the same persuasion as their predecessors. Some of the documents which have been released during the last 18 months are extremely revealing and significant. And he's gone. He had to leave early, but we are so fortunate to have Major of Military Intelligence, John Newman, he's retired, just retired, to analyze these documents for us. The Assassination Records Review Board, although it is an official government body, may prove to be the greatest ally our cause has ever known. The backgrounds of their members and the manner in which they have sought out our input and cooperation are enormously encouraging. The scope of their mandate and indications of their resolve to fulfill that mandate are even more encouraging. And it's crucial that we supply them with our complete cooperation and support. Now, before I go on and say a few final words, I want to tell you that each year I've thought, as this is the 4th symposium, it's the smallest crowd we've ever had. But each year I've thought it can't be better next year. But to me, it's been better each year. And this year, there are two things that have made this the best for me. One is renewing acquaintances. I saw Dick Maxwell this morning. He came to my house many years ago. And I knew his face, and I had to look at his badge to put a name with a face. However, many of you who are here have been here 4 years. Miss Schneider from California and her husband. Even Eve and Erin and the head of A.S.K, Roland. He's beginning to know you people, and it's good to see you. And when we miss one of you, who, some of them have been here 3 past years, they're not here. I went up to Joe Backus and I said, "What's wrong with Joanna Brown? She's been here the 3 previous years, and she's a wonderful asset to this pursuit." And he told me there wasn't anything really wrong. She just couldn't make it this year. I miss Tricia McGowan, who's been here the 3 previous years. I look out at the crowd and I see Martin Shackelford. He's been here all 4 years. He so far has not taken a really active part in panels or anything, but he's a valuable worker, and we see him on bulletin boards, and he's written great articles for the publications that we have. We've made new friends. In the last 2 years, we've met Adele Edison, and we've met Frank Camper, and when I met Paul Haller from Florida the other night for the first time, I said, "But you've been here every year." "No, this is my first one." Well, I've talked to him all this time, and I felt like I knew him. I've met Mr. Heller, and I believe he's from Indiana. And these people, the new ones are, if anything, more important than those of us who've been coming every year. Todd Sanders from Dundee, Scotland. He was here last year, but he gave me some constructive criticism. We want this. We want to have an input in what you think, what we should be doing to make it a better conference. Bill O'Neill from California has been here all 4 years. Some of these people have, it's impossible to thank them enough for what they've done. Mike Blackwell and Richard Bartholomew from Pflugerville. Well, you heard the great work that Richard Bartholomew has done. each one of you, you're so important. I look out and I see Joe Riley, Dr. Joseph Riley. He's been on a program for us. This is his first symposium. And, you know, I feel like I know him because I've talked to him and exchanged email and United States mail with him. He's contributed so much already in just a short time. And we hope that all of you will come back. And if you have a particular area of expertise, Gary and I don't have the final say in this. For every 5 that we recommend, we'd like to have this one on the program. They take maybe 1 of you. But let us know what you're interested in. You may be working in an area that we know nothing about. And we'd like to hear about it and see if we can present it to the people. Let's disperse now with the conviction that we're all one with our target. Let us nourish that conviction with a spirit of civility and cooperation which the seriousness of this subject demands. Just a minute. Oh, I wanted to tell you one other person I wanted to mention, and he's not here. Ross Ralston is here. He's probably over at Dealey Plaza by now. But Ross started calling me in 1969. He's written 2 books, and he came to my house in 1972, and I saw him. He looks just exactly the same as he did, doesn't he, Hal? He hasn't changed a bit. I've changed, but he hasn't. But it was so good to see Ross and know that he is as dedicated today as he was in 1969. And this means so much to us. But let us rededicate ourselves to the urgent purpose which brought us into this arena and deport ourselves in a manner which will reflect credit on this most worthy enterprise. Thank you.
Just 1 second and I'll let you go. I can't stand up here without saying thank you. You know, first of all to you for being here. A big, big thank you to the panelists who gave of their time, their secrets in some cases, their material to share with you and to hopefully instill in you a further desire to continue on in this research and this effort. So thank you to the people at A.S.K. who I think do a classy job of directing this. Now, you may not like everything they do, but when you're dealing with this many people, you can't please everybody, and you've got to keep it running. And I think they do the best job of any I've ever been to, and I'm thankful to them, and I hope you'll tell them how much you appreciate them when you see them. I'll leave you with this. This is my dear friend Walt Brown, who gave the keynote, and I had him write me a couple of things down that if he were going to close this thing out, what he would say. And he wrote this down. Together we can find the truth, and A.S.K. has asked the right questions. Please continue to help us to find the right answers. And with that, I'll give you that old Texas thing, when you're out in the hunt, sick 'em. See you down at Dealey Plaza.